17-year-old Haley Knox entered the courtroom with a smirk that made every heart freeze. She laughed at the family of the boy she had killed as if the trial were a joke. Her pink acrylic nails tapped against the defense table while the victim's mother clutched a framed photograph with trembling hands. Haley thought her age would protect her. She thought her father's money would shield her. She thought the word accident would erase the body she left bleeding in a crosswalk. But the most damning voice in that room wasn't the prosecutors. It wasn't the juries. It was the judges. A woman who had seen 1,000 faces like Haley's and knew exactly what needed to happen next. Stories like this remind us that justice always finds its way. Arrogance might play well on social media, but it doesn't survive under oath. If you believe in accountability and that every victim deserves a voice, subscribe now and share your thoughts below. Because in cases like this, society is the silent jury watching. This is how it all began. Just weeks earlier, in the small city of Belridge, 18-year-old Mateo Torres was doing everything right. He worked part-time at the campus bookstore to help pay for textbooks. He texted his mother every night to let her know he was safe. On the night of September 23rd, he stood at a crosswalk at the intersection of Maple and 7th Street, waiting patiently for the signal to change. The light turned white. He stepped into the road, trusting a system designed to protect him. At that exact moment, a white Lexus SUV barreled toward the same intersection, music blaring, a Snapchat video recording in the front seat. Haley Knox was behind the wheel, eyes flicking between her phone and the road. The light facing her direction turned red. She had a choice. And in the split second that followed, she made the one that would destroy 2 families forever. The courtroom smelled like old wood and nervous sweat, a scent that clung to the walls of the Belridge County Courthouse like a permanent stain. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh glow over rows of wooden benches packed with reporters, community members, and a cluster of grieving faces who had come to witness what they hoped would be justice. At the defense table, Haley Knox sat in an oversized beige jail sweatshirt, hands cuffed at the waist, her posture slouched in a way that suggested boredom rather than remorse. Her eyes drifted toward the camera lenses lining the back wall. And for a moment, the corners of her mouth lifted into that same crooked smile that had haunted the Torres family for months. It was the kind of smile that didn't belong in a place like this, where lives were weighed and futures decided. Judge Meredith Cole shuffled the sentencing papers in front of her, glasses perched on the edge of her nose, gray hair pulled back in a tight bun that left no room for softness. She had presided over hundreds of cases in her 23 years on the bench, but something about this one had settled differently in her chest. The gallery was unusually full for a weekday morning, every seat claimed, people standing against the back wall with arms crossed and expressions that ranged from curiosity to cold fury. In the front row, Tridlina Torres clutched a framed photograph of her son so tightly her knuckles had gone white. The picture showed Mateo on the day he left for college, standing in front of a dorm building with cardboard boxes at his feet, his smile wide and full of a future that would never arrive. Next to her, Rafael Torres sat rigid, hands folded in his lap, staring straight ahead as if afraid that blinking might release the tears he'd been holding back since they walked through the courthouse doors. The court clerk leaned toward the microphone and mispronounced Haley's middle name, stumbling over the syllables. A soft chuckle escaped Haley's lips, audible enough that several heads turned. She glanced at her attorney, Mark Ellison, as if they were sharing an inside joke, her eyes bright with something that looked disturbingly close to amusement. A bailiff standing near the defense table leaned down and whispered sharply for her to stop. Haley rolled her eyes, biting back a grin, and shifted in her seat like a student being scolded for passing notes in class. The moment was brief, but it was captured by every camera in the room, every reporter scribbling in a notebook, every juror who had spent weeks watching her perform. What they now understood was a carefully rehearsed role. To Lena Torres, That chuckle felt like a knife pressed against an open wound, a reminder that the girl who had taken her son's life still didn't understand the weight of what she had done. Haley's pink acrylic nails tapped a quiet rhythm on the edge of the defense table, a nervous habit she couldn't quite suppress. The sound was soft but persistent, like the ticking of a clock in a silent room, and it grated against the solemnity of the proceedings. In the front row, Lena's hands trembled as she adjusted the frame in her lap, fingers tracing the edges of the glass as if touching the photograph could somehow bring Mateo closer. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Youth against age, entitlement against grief, manicured nails against weathered hands that had worked for decades to give a son opportunities he would never get to use. Reporters later described the scene as a visual representation of everything wrong with the case. A teenager accused of taking a life sitting in a courtroom like she was waiting for a dentist appointment, while the family of her victim sat feet away, struggling to breathe through the weight of their loss. Her friends once called her Invincible Haley, a nickname that started as a joke but grew into something closer to a belief system. She was the girl who never faced real consequences, whose parking tickets disappeared after a phone call from her father, whose school suspensions were reduced to warnings after meetings between expensive lawyers and nervous administrators. Teachers who tried to hold her accountable found themselves reassigned or quietly told to let certain issues go. Classmates who challenged her learned quickly that crossing Haley Knox meant dealing with her father's influence, which stretched from the school board to the police department to the courthouse steps where protesters now gathered with signs. In her world, rules were suggestions, and consequences were things that happened to other people, people without money, without connections, without the invisible safety net that had caught her every time she stumbled. She carried that same energy into the courtroom, convinced on some level that this too would disappear if she just waited it out. Her defense attorney leaned over, his voice low and urgent as he murmured, "You need to look serious. The judge is watching." Haley shrugged, barely moving her shoulders, her gaze drifting toward the ceiling tiles, as if counting them was more interesting than the man trying to save her from a lengthy prison sentence. To her, this was still some sort of performance, a bad dream she'd wake up from and laugh about later with friends who would tell her she was brave for enduring it. She had spent the last several months convincing herself that the system would bend the way it always had, that her age would protect her, that the word accident would carry more weight than the choices she made in the hours leading up to the crash. She didn't yet understand that courtrooms operate on a different currency than high school hallways, that money and influence can only stretch so far before they snap under the weight of evidence and public scrutiny. The prosecution called for the courtroom's attention, and an enlarged still frame was placed on an easel by the jury box. The image was grainy, pulled from a traffic camera, time-stamped 1:42 a.m. It showed a white SUV barreling through an intersection, headlights cutting across a dark pedestrian crosswalk like searchlights hunting prey. In the bottom corner, a blurred human figure had just stepped off the curb, one foot suspended in midair, mere seconds before impact. A second still, displayed beside the first, showed the same SUV speeding away, brake lights never flashing, tail lights disappearing into the darkness as if nothing had happened. The prosecutor let the images speak for themselves, his silence more powerful than any words he could offer. This footage was the reason no amount of smiling, no matter how practiced or confident, would save Haley Knox. This was the moment her belief in being untouchable collided with the reality that someone had been watching all along. Judge Cole looked at Haley for a long, silent moment, her expression unreadable, the kind of face that had been trained over decades to reveal nothing before the right time. She lowered her gaze to the sentencing guidelines in front of her, fingers tracing a line down the page as if measuring the distance between mercy and justice. The courtroom held its breath, the only sound the faint hum of the ventilation system and the shuffle of someone shifting uncomfortably in the back row. Finally, Judge Cole spoke, her voice measured and calm, each word chosen with the precision of someone who understood that what she said next would echo far beyond these walls. "Miss Knox," she began, pausing to let the name settle in the air, "you've shown this court a side of yourself that is revealing." Haley's smirk flickered back into place, a reflex she couldn't quite control. As if bracing for another lecture, she planned to tune out the same way she had tuned out teachers, counselors, and anyone else who tried to tell her that actions had consequences. But today, in this room, she was about to discover that she was not untouchable. Not here. Not anymore. It was a late September afternoon in Belridge, the kind of day when the air smelled like fallen leaves and the first hint of cold weather that made students pull hoodies from the backs of their closets. The small city was known for its tree-lined streets and a university campus that swelled the population each fall, filling coffee shops and bookstores with young faces chasing degrees and dreams. 18-year-old Mateo Torres pedaled his bike home from his part-time job at the campus bookstore, a messenger bag slung across his shoulder, heavy with textbooks he planned to study later that night. He stopped at a traffic light, balancing the bike between his legs. Oken pulled out his phone to send his mother a quick text. "Late shift tonight. Don't wait up." He added a heart emoji, the way he always did, a small gesture that had become their ritual. The sun was low, casting golden light over brick buildings, and students crossing lawns with backpacks and laughter, their voices carrying on the breeze. No one on that street, least of all Mateo, knew this was one of his last unremarkable moments alive. Mateo was a first-generation college student, the kind of achievement his family celebrated with tears and prayers and a small party in their duplex where neighbors brought food, and his younger siblings made a banner that read, "College Boy," in crooked letters. He was majoring in engineering, a field he chose because he wanted to build things that lasted, things that kept people safe. He worked nights at the bookstore to help pay for textbooks and send a little money back home, refusing to let his parents shoulder the entire burden of his education. His high school teachers remembered a quiet, focused kid who tutored classmates in math without being asked and never missed a deadline, even when it meant staying up past midnight to finish assignments. Friends described him as the one who always walked others home after late study sessions, the one who checked to make sure everyone got back safely, cautious almost to a fault. He was the kind of teenager who triple-checked crosswalk signals, who waited for the white walk symbol even when the street was empty and waiting felt silly. At home in a modest duplex on the edge of town, Lena prepared arroz con pollo in a kitchen that smelled like garlic and cumin, the stove crowded with pots that had been passed down from her mother. Raphael fixed a squeaky cabinet door, muttering in Spanish about how the landlord never fixed anything, his toolbox open on the counter next to a stack of bills he'd been avoiding. Two younger siblings argued over a video game in the living room, their noise a familiar backdrop to family life, the kind of chaos that felt like love. On a small shelf by the kitchen table, Mateo's high school graduation photo was displayed next to a candle and a tiny statue of the Virgin Mary, a setup the family had jokingly called his first shrine when he left for college. It was meant as playful pride, a nod to their hopes for his future. Soon, that shelf would become something very different, a place where they would leave flowers and whispered prayers. A corner of the house where grief lived permanently. The same evening, across town, Haley Knox scrolled through her phone in a sprawling suburban kitchen with marble countertops, stainless steel appliances, and framed family photos from ski trips to Aspen and beach resorts in the Caribbean. She complained to her mother that she shouldn't have to drive the old white SUV when her friends had brand new cars with better sound systems and heated seats. Her mother, Elaine, barely looked up from her laptop, offering a distracted hum of acknowledgement. Her father, Robert, was on a business call in his home office, half listening as he waved his hand dismissively and said through the open door, "Just don't get another ticket, Haley." She rolled her eyes. thinking about the last speeding citation that had disappeared after what her father called a talk between him and a police sergeant he'd known for years. The ticket had vanished from the system like it never existed. Another small miracle in a life built on small miracles that taught her the rules didn't really apply. 2 teenagers, 2 families, 2 cars moving toward the same intersection in the dark, their paths converging in a way that no one could have stopped except the one person who refused to try. At Belridge High, staff conversations about Haley followed a familiar pattern, whispered in teacher lounges and during hall duty shifts. She was brilliant when she tried, capable of acing exams without studying, but disruptive when she didn't feel like playing along. She constantly tested limits. On parking in handicap spots, because it's closer, vaping in bathrooms and laughing when caught, skipping detentions when they interfered with weekend plans. Each time, consequences were softened by apologetic emails from her parents, veiled legal language from attorneys, and carefully worded donations to school programs that suddenly made disciplinary files disappear. A biology teacher once tried to fail her for plagiarism, only to find herself called into a meeting with the principal, and a lawyer who suggested the evidence was circumstantial. The teacher passed her with a warning, and Haley learned once again that persistence and power could erase mistakes. It was the foundation of her belief in being untouchable, a belief built brick by brick every time an adult looked the other way. That same week, Mateo updated his online scholarship profile, writing carefully about his dream of becoming a civil engineer and designing safer roads and bridges for communities that need them most. He told a friend over coffee that he wanted to work on projects that make sure people get home alive, a line that would later haunt his family when they read through his saved documents. On his bedroom wall, a calendar was marked with exam dates in blue ink, work shifts in red, and a circled weekend trip home to visit his grandmother, who had been asking when he'd come back to fix her porch railing. His world was small but hopeful, built on effort and the quiet certainty that doing the right thing mattered, that working hard and following the rules would eventually pay off. The contrast with Haley's loosely supervised privilege grew sharper with every detail. 2 lives lived in the same city, but in completely different universes, one built on earning trust and the other on assuming it would always be given. Mateo got a last-minute text from his manager just as he was finishing dinner. "Can you cover the late shift at the bookstore? Sarah called in sick." He hesitated, thinking about the long walk home after midnight, the empty streets and flickering streetlights that always made his mother nervous. But he thought about the extra hours on his paycheck, the textbook he needed for his engineering class, the small amount he could send home to help with his sister's school supplies. He texted back, "Yeah, I got it." Lena saw the exchange over his shoulder and frowned, worrying aloud about him walking in the dark. He reassured her the way he always did, promising to stay in well-lit areas, use the crosswalks, stick to his usual route. It was a familiar compromise in working-class families. Safety weighed against the need to say yes to opportunity, to never turn down a shift, because you never knew when the next one would come. He kissed his mother on the cheek, grabbed his messenger bag, and headed out the door, calling back that he'd text when he got home. In the final image of that evening, Mateo locked his bike outside the bookstore under a flickering streetlight, looping the cable through the frame and securing it with a U-lock out of habit. He tugged on it twice to make sure it held, a ritual he performed every time. The careful gestures of someone who had been taught to protect what he owned, because replacing things wasn't easy. The camera lingered on the U-lock snapping shut, a symbol of how carefully he tried to navigate a world that didn't always care about carefulness. Across town, Haley tossed a set of car keys in the air, catching them with casual confidence as she laughed at a friend's message on her phone, the keys glinting under the kitchen lights. 2 hands with keys, one locking up, one about to unlock, one person securing what mattered, the other careless about what came next. The echo hung there in the space between two worlds, hinting that only one of them would return home that night, and that the distance between safety and tragedy was sometimes just a choice made in the flicker of a red light. It was past 1:30 in the morning when Mateo finally closed the bookstore, stacking the last few textbooks on their designated shelves and shutting off the humming fluorescent lights that had given him a headache for the past 3 hours. The campus was quiet, emptied of daytime chatter and the rush of students hurrying between classes, replaced only by distant music from a dorm party several blocks away, and the occasional passing car. He bundled up in a light jacket, the September night cooler than he'd expected, and shifted his messenger bag across his shoulder, adjusting the strap so it wouldn't dig into his neck on the walk home. His route took him through the main intersection at Maple and 7th, a crossing with clear white lines painted across the asphalt, and a traffic camera mounted on a pole above, silently recording every vehicle that passed beneath its unblinking lens. He checked his phone one more time, seeing a missed message from his mom. "Home yet?" He decided to answer once he was across the street, not wanting to text and walk at the same time, following the safety rules that had been drilled into him since childhood. A few miles away, Haley sped down a suburban side street in the white Lexus SUV her parents had bought, used when she got her license, the kind of car that still carried the smell of leather and luxury even if it was a few years old. 3 friends were crammed inside, music blaring from the upgraded speakers, the bass vibrating through the seats, and the glow of multiple phone screens lighting up the interior like a constellation of distractions. Snapchats captured half-smiling faces and scrolling song titles, of fleeting moments meant to disappear but destined to become evidence. An open hard seltzer can rattled in a door cup holder, the condensation leaving a ring on the plastic, and another can rolled under the passenger seat every time Haley took a turn too fast. One friend complained that it was late, and she needed to be home before her parents woke up, her voice edged with the kind of anxiety that came from knowing consequences actually existed in her house. Haley shrugged and pressed the accelerator harder, laughing as she said, "Relax, I drive better with a buzz anyway." No one in the car pushed back hard enough to change her mind, and that silence became its own kind of agreement. At the Maple and 7th intersection, the traffic signal cycled calmly between red and green, an indifferent metronome over the sleeping city, its rhythm unchanged by the weight of what was about to happen. Mateo arrived at the curb and stopped, waiting patiently for the pedestrian signal, even though the streets appeared empty, the kind of empty that made waiting feel pointless, but also made him feel safer for doing it anyway. A security camera from a nearby convenience store caught him adjusting his bag strap, looking both ways more than once, his head turning left and right in the careful choreography of someone who had been taught that visibility didn't guarantee safety. The crosswalk light changed to white, the universal symbol that told him it was his turn, that the system had allocated this moment for him to cross. He stepped off the curb, trusting a design meant to protect him, his footsteps steady and unhurried. Simultaneously, down the road, the light facing Haley's direction turned yellow, then red, a clear command to stop that she would have seen if she'd been looking at the road instead of the phone in her hand. Inside the SUV, Haley's phone buzzed with a new notification, the screen lighting up with a message from a friend at another party, teasing, "Where are you guys? This is so much better." Haley lifted her phone from the console to record a quick Snapchat clip of them singing along to the chorus, her eyes flicking between the screen and the road in a rhythm that felt natural to her but was anything but safe. The passenger giggled and warned, red light," but it was more of a sing-song tease than a real command, the kind of thing you say when you're not actually worried because you trust the person driving even when you shouldn't. Haley glanced up, saw the yellow light snapping to red, and made a split-second decision that everyone involved in the case would later debate in courtrooms and comment sections and late-night conversations. She accelerated instead of braking, her foot pressing down on the gas pedal as she muttered, "We're fine. There's nobody out." It was a gamble based on assumptions, on the belief that empty-looking streets actually were empty, that the world would bend to accommodate her impatience. The white SUV ripped through the red-lit intersection, tires humming against the asphalt, the sound of the engine rising as Haley pushed through the acceleration. Mateo was already halfway across the crosswalk, his body moving through the space the signal had promised him was safe, when he heard the engine rev. His head turned instinctively toward the sound. The way anyone's would, his brain processing the wrongness of a car approaching too fast, in a moment when cars weren't supposed to be moving at all. The traffic camera captured the collision in 2 choppy frames, the low resolution unable to smooth the violence into anything comprehensible. Headlights flooding the lens, a flash of movement, a dark shape thrown violently out of the frame. Witnesses in nearby apartments later reported a sickening thud that didn't sound like metal on metal, but something softer and more final, followed by a short, high-pitched scream from inside the car. Then silence, the kind that felt heavier than any noise, except for the fading echo of the SUV speeding away, its taillights disappearing into the darkness like a guilty secret. Mateo's body landed near the curb. Now, the impact throwing him several feet from where he'd been struck, his limbs arranged in angles that bodies weren't meant to hold. His messenger bag was flung even farther, textbooks spilling across the road like abandoned thoughts, pages fluttering in the breeze created by passing cars that wouldn't arrive for several more minutes. A single streetlight above the scene fussed and flickered, the bulb struggling as if it too had been shaken by what just happened, then steadied its beam over the crosswalk, illuminating the white stripes now smeared with fresh blood that looked black under the sodium lights. A security guard from campus housing, out on a smoke break because he couldn't sleep, heard the impact and felt it in his chest before his brain understood what the sound meant. He ran toward the intersection, phone already in his hand, fingers fumbling to dial 911 as his mind tried to process the shape on the ground that he knew, with horrible certainty, was a person. He found Mateo barely breathing, eyes half open and unfocused, staring at something that wasn't the sky or the street light or the face of the stranger now kneeling beside him. A faint, rattling sound came from his chest. The kind of breathing that signaled something fundamental was broken inside. The guard pressed his hand against Mateo's shoulder, not sure if he should move him or keep him still, his training from years ago fighting against the panic rising in his throat. He repeated, "Stay with me. Stay with me," his voice cracking on the second repetition as distant sirens began to grow louder, piercing the night with the promise of help that would arrive too late to matter. Blood pooled beneath Mateo's head, spreading slowly across the pavement, and the guard realized with dawning horror that he was watching someone die, that the hand under his palm was growing colder, that the rattling breath was becoming slower and more shallow with each passing second. In the SUV, panic erupted in a cacophony of screams and sobs that shattered the illusion of invincibility they'd been riding on all night. One girl was crying uncontrollably, her hands covering her face as she rocked back and forth in the back seat. Another was screaming that they hit something and insisting they should turn back, her voice shrill and desperate, hands gripping the back of Haley's seat. Haley's face had drained of color, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. She kept murmuring, "It was a deer. It was just a deer. We're not stopping," repeating it like a spell that could change reality if she said it enough times. Her passenger in the front seat looked back through the rear window, straining to see through the darkness, and caught sight of a shape lying motionless in the road, growing smaller in the distance. She realized with a sick, sinking feeling that it wasn't an animal, that the size and shape were all wrong. "You have to stop," she cried, her voice breaking. "That wasn't a deer. Haley, you have to stop." But Haley snapped back, her voice sharp with fear and something darker. "Do you want my life to be over? "Do you?" That line would later be repeated in court as a summary of her priorities in the moment when everything mattered most, and the moment when she chose herself over the broken body in her rearview mirror. The chapter ended with an overhead perspective from the traffic camera, a bird's-eye view of the intersection now empty except for the flashing red and blue lights of emergency vehicles arriving on scene. Paramedics knelt over Mateo's still form, their movements quick and practiced and desperate, hands cutting away clothing to access wounds, voices calling out medical terms that sounded like a foreign language to the security guard now standing back to give them room. His phone lay nearby on the pavement, screen cracked in a spiderweb pattern from where it had fallen during the impact, the unread message from his mother still visible behind the shattered glass. Home yet? The question hung there, unanswered and unanswerable. Across town, the white SUV slipped quietly into a darkened driveway, its engine ticking as it cooled, the front bumper cracked and paint scuffed in a way that would be impossible to explain as a minor fender bender. Two forms lay still in the dark, one in a crosswalk, surrounded by strangers trying to save him, one inside a cooling engine bay, silently testifying to what just happened, both of them proof that some choices can never be taken back. At the hospital, doctors fought to stabilize Mateo in a trauma bay that smelled like disinfectant and blood, their hands moving with the practiced efficiency of people who had seen too many nights like this one. His injuries were catastrophic, the kind that made even experienced emergency room physicians exchange grim looks over their surgical masks: skull fracture with visible brain matter, multiple internal hemorrhages painting his abdomen purple beneath the skin, broken ribs that had punctured his left lung and sent it collapsing like a deflated balloon. Despite rapid intervention, despite bags of blood and plasma pumping into his veins, despite the breathing tube forced down his throat and the compressions that cracked more ribs in an attempt to restart his failing heart, he was pronounced dead within an hour of arrival. The attending physician pulled off his gloves with a snap that sounded too loud in the sudden quiet, and a hospital chaplain was summoned to make the worst call a parent could ever receive. At 3:07 in the morning, he dialed the Torres family number, his voice already heavy with the weight of words he'd spoken too many times before. Lena answered on the third ring, half asleep and confused, her voice thick as she said hello into the darkness of her bedroom. At first, when the chaplain identified himself and mentioned an accident, she assumed he was calling about minor injuries, maybe a broken bone or stitches, something fixable. Her brain couldn't make the leap to anything worse, because worse wasn't something she allowed herself to imagine. When the words didn't make it, finally landed, cutting through her confusion like a blade, a raw animal cry tore from her throat, a sound she didn't know she was capable of making. It was the kind of scream that didn't sound human, the kind that carried the weight of every moment she'd ever feared this exact phone call. The noise woke everyone in the house. Raphael bolting upright in bed, the younger siblings stumbling into the hallway in their pajamas. All of them drawn to the kitchen where their mother had collapsed against the counter, phone still pressed to her ear, her body shaking so violently she couldn't stand. Back at Maple and 7th, patrol officers secured the intersection with bright yellow tape that snapped in the early morning breeze, diverting the sparse traffic that trickled through as the city slowly woke. They documented the scene with the methodical precision of people trained to turn tragedy into evidence, photographing the scattered textbooks, the single shoe lying yards from where the body had been, the skid marks that weren't there because the driver had never attempted to stop. One officer crouched near the curb and pointed his flashlight at something glinting in the beam. It was a plastic shard from a headlight, translucent and jagged. It's small enough to fit in his palm, but significant enough to carry the weight of a conviction. He bagged it carefully, labeling it with the case number that would follow this evidence through labs and courtrooms. The senior officer on scene, a 20-year veteran named Rodriguez, stood back and surveyed the crosswalk with weary disgust. He'd worked enough hit and runs to recognize the pattern. No brake marks, no attempt to render aid, just flight and the hope that darkness would erase guilt. A technician from the city's traffic department arrived in a van marked with the municipal logo, called out of bed to pull footage from the intersection camera. He and Officer Rodriguez huddled over a laptop screen inside the vehicle, the interior lit by the blue glow of the monitor as they scrubbed backwards through low-resolution video. 2 hours of empty intersections flickered past until they reached 1:42 a.m. And there it was, the moment frozen in digital time. The white SUV blowing through the red light, the impact visible as a blur of motion, the vehicle accelerating away without pause. The make and model weren't immediately clear from the pixelated footage, the image degraded by distance and darkness, but the approximate size and shape were visible. More importantly, the distinctive damage to the front right headlight after the collision was captured in one frame, the light shattering and going dark. Rodriguez leaned closer to the screen, his jaw tight, and spoke quietly into his body cam for the record. "We've got visual on the suspect vehicle. White SUV, midsize, front-end damage, broken passenger headlight. You'll last seen heading west on Maple." Officers fanned out through the neighborhood, knocking on doors of nearby apartments and businesses, waking bleary residents who answered in bathrobes and confusion. Most had been asleep, insulated by walls and white noise machines from the violence that had unfolded on their street. A college student on a third-floor balcony recalled hearing loud music passing below his window, then a sudden spike in engine noise that made him look up from his phone, followed by a dull crash that he'd initially dismissed as a garbage truck. Another witness, a rideshare driver who had been passing a block away, reported seeing a white SUV flying down Maple minutes before the estimated time of impact, the vehicle swerving slightly as it took a turn too fast. He described it as nice, newer, definitely not a beat-up car. Details that would later support theories about the socio-economic profile of the driver. These fragments of observation, scattered across different witnesses and different moments, would later be assembled into a timeline that constructed a hauntingly clear picture. The driver had options, had awareness, had time, and chose the worst possible response at every turn. When Lena and Raphael arrived at the hospital, escorted by a victim services coordinator who met them in the parking lot, they were led to a quiet room on the second floor, the kind with soft chairs and boxes of tissues strategically placed on every surface. The coordinator's presence alone signaled bad news. People in her position didn't meet families to deliver hope. Shed, the doctor who had worked on Mateo, entered a few minutes later, his scrubs still marked with stains he hadn't had time to change, and he explained the extent of the injuries in gentle clinical terms meant to soften the brutality of what had happened. But the only thing that registered through the roaring in Lena's ears was the outcome. He is gone. Those 3 words, simple and final, collapsed the architecture of her world. She insisted on seeing him, her voice rising with desperation when the staff hesitated and they reluctantly allowed a brief visit in the trauma bay. Machines stood silent around his still body, tubes and wires disconnected, his face cleaned of blood but marked with abrasions that would never heal. Lena kissed his forehead, her lips trembling, and noticed a tiny scar near his eyebrow from a childhood bike fall, on a detail that suddenly contained every memory of every scraped knee and bedtime story and birthday cake, all of it collapsing into this one unbearable moment. The lead detective, Aaron Mills, arrived on scene just before dawn, coffee in hand and eyes already scanning for details with the practiced focus of someone who had worked homicides for 15 years. He reviewed the camera footage on the technician's laptop, watched the collision 3 times without speaking, then read through the initial scene reports filed by the responding officers. After absorbing the evidence, he officially classified the case as a fatal hit-and-run with the potential for elevation to vehicular homicide pending further investigation. He immediately requested a BOLO be on the lookout for a white SUV with front-end damage possibly missing or with a broken right headlight, last seen heading west from Maple and 7th. The alert went out to every patrol car in the city, a digital net spreading across neighborhoods and highways. Officers began quietly scanning streets and driveways, looking for vehicles that matched the description, checking parked cars with the systematic attention of people who understood that someone, somewhere, had driven home with blood on their bumper and guilt in their chest. Just as the sun began to rise, painting the scene in soft orange light that felt obscenely beautiful against the backdrop of tragedy, an officer radioed in with a tone of barely contained excitement. He'd been canvassing an upscale neighborhood on the west side, checking driveways as he passed. When he spotted it, a white Lexus SUV parked crookedly in the driveway of a large colonial-style home, the kind with stone columns and a 3-car garage. He pulled closer, his spotlight illuminating the vehicle, and his pulse quickened. The front bumper was visibly cracked, shards of plastic hanging loose like broken teeth. The right headlight assembly looked recently smashed, fragments still clinging to the socket. Most damning of all, there appeared to be a dark smear along the hood, too high up and too distinct to be from a minor parking lot collision. He ran the license plate through the system, his radio crackling as the database returned a name. Registered to Robert and Elaine Knox, residents of the address where the vehicle currently sat. He quietly requested backup, his voice steady, but his hands tightening on the steering wheel as he stared at the SUV that had, just hours earlier, turned a crosswalk into a crime scene. The chapter closed with a visual contrast that captured the diverging realities of two families on the same morning. At the Torres home, blinds stayed open despite the early hour, lights blazing in every room as family members clustered together in the living room, a circle of shared grief that didn't know how to exist in darkness. Relatives arrived with food no one would eat. Neighbors came with condolences that couldn't penetrate the fog. And in the center of it all, Lena sat on the couch, staring at nothing, her hands clutching Mateo's graduation photo. At the Knox residence, curtains were drawn tight against the morning sun. The house silent and still, except for the hum of central air conditioning. The white SUV sat in the driveway like a silent accomplice, its cracked bumper catching the light, waiting to tell the story. Its driver refused to speak. In one home, a missing son was irrelevant to the question of guilt because the guilt was someone else's. In the other, a damaged car was everything, the physical manifestation of choices that could no longer be hidden. One family had lost their son and would never get him back. The other had just lost the luxury of pretending consequences didn't exist, and the reckoning had only just begun. At 7 o'clock in the morning, Detective Mills and 2 uniformed officers rang the doorbell at the Knox residence, the chime echoing through the house with a melody that sounded too cheerful for the moment. Elaine answered in a silk robe, her hair wrapped in a towel, startled by the sight of police badges on her immaculate stone porch. Behind her, the foyer gleamed with polished marble floors, high ceilings that made voices echo, and a curved staircase lined with framed family portraits showing ski trips and graduation ceremonies and carefully posed smiles. Fresh flowers sat in a vase on a console table, the kind of detail that spoke to a life where aesthetics mattered. Mills politely but firmly introduced himself and asked who had driven the white Lexus parked in the driveway the previous night. Elaine's eyes flicked toward the driveway, confusion crossing her face as she tried to understand why police were asking about the car. A subtle tension entered the air, the kind you feel when something shifts from normal to not normal, like a hairline crack appearing in fine china. Haley appeared at the top of the stairs, hair in a messy bun, phone in her hand, squinting down at the officers with the annoyed expression of someone woken too early. She was wearing pajama shorts and an oversized sweatshirt, the picture of teenage casualness. But her eyes had the faint redness of someone who hadn't slept well or had been crying. When Mills asked directly if she had used the car overnight, She hesitated, her mouth opening and closing as she searched for the right answer. Finally, she shrugged and said, "Just to pick up a friend and come back." Nothing happened. The words came out defensive, the tone of someone already preparing to be accused. Her father, Robert, joined them from the hallway, sensing a problem with the instincts of someone used to managing crises. He was still in his workout clothes, a towel draped over his shoulder, and he immediately asked if they had a warrant, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to controlling conversations. Mills explained calmly that they were investigating a fatal collision and that the vehicle parked outside appeared to match the description of the suspect vehicle. At the word fatal, Elaine's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes widening as she glanced toward the driveway where the Lexus sat in full morning light. Outside, crime scene technicians began photographing the Lexus from multiple angles, their cameras clicking in rapid succession as they documented every inch of damage. The cracked bumper, the shattered right headlight with fragments still clinging to the housing, the faint reddish-brown smear on the hood that could have been rust or dirt, but probably wasn't. One technician crouched down with a swab kit, carefully collecting samples from the suspected bloodstain, sealing each swab in a sterile tube that would be sent to the lab for DNA analysis. Another technician held small plastic fragments recovered from the scene next to the broken pieces on the car, comparing them under the morning sun. The measurements aligned almost perfectly, edges matching like puzzle pieces that had been violently separated. Mills stood back and watched, speaking quietly into his handheld recorder. Preliminary visual match between debris recovered at scene and damage on vehicle registered to Knox family. Apparent biological material on hood pending lab confirmation. The Lexus stopped being just an object in that moment. It became a bridge between a dead teenager lying in a morgue and a living one standing in a doorway, trying to figure out how much trouble she was actually in. With consent initially withheld by Robert Knox, who insisted they were overstepping and that his daughter had rights, Mills stepped back and radioed for a judge to approve an emergency warrant to search the vehicle. He'd expected resistance. Wealthy families always hired lawyers first and cooperated later. Within 40 minutes, the warrant came through, signed by a judge who had been briefed on the severity of the case and the time-sensitive nature of evidence preservation. Once granted, Mills and the techs opened the doors of the Lexus, and immediately they were hit with a smell that made them exchange knowing looks. Stale alcohol, poorly masked by expensive vanilla air freshener, of the kind that came in decorative clips attached to the vents. In the cup holder, an empty hard seltzer can sat upright, condensation long dried. Under the passenger seat, another can lay partially crushed, the metal dented as if someone had stepped on it while getting out. On the floor mat, a smear of what appeared to be dried vomit suggested someone in the car had been sick after the impact, their body rejecting what their mind was trying to process. Every detail strengthened the narrative that this wasn't just an unfortunate accident, but the predictable outcome of a night built on bad decisions stacked on top of each other. Mills requested access to Haley's phone, his tone professional but insistent, explaining that digital evidence was crucial to reconstructing the timeline. Haley clutched the device to her chest like a life raft, he shaking her head and looking to her father for support. Robert stepped between them, stating firmly that they were done cooperating without legal counsel present, that this had gone far enough. Mills nodded, unsurprised, and explained that he would be requesting another warrant, this time for her call logs, text messages, and social media activity from the previous night. He laid out what they anticipated finding: Snapchat stories, group chats, possibly even videos taken inside the SUV moments before or after the impact. The family's faces went pale as the implications sank in. Phones had become witnesses that never forgot, archives of every swipe and tap and post, all of it date-stamped and geotagged and stored on servers that couldn't be intimidated by lawyers or money. In the modern age of investigation, Trying to hide digital evidence was like trying to hide footprints in fresh snow. The marks were already there, frozen in time, waiting to be discovered. That afternoon, Detective Mills visited the Torres home, moving carefully through a living room now flooded with relatives and neighbors who had come to sit with the family in their grief. The air was thick with whispered prayers and the smell of food brought by people who didn't know what else to offer. Lena sat on the couch in the same clothes she'd worn to the hospital, clutching a box of tissues, her eyes so swollen from crying they were nearly closed. Raphael gripped the armrest of his chair so tightly his knuckles had gone white, his jaw set in a way that suggested he was holding back a rage that had nowhere safe to go. Mills sat across from them, hat in his hands, and explained in gentle terms that they had identified a possible suspect vehicle and were working to confirm who was driving at the time of the collision. He was careful not to say the name Knox yet, not wanting to raise expectations before charges were filed, not wanting to promise something the system might fail to deliver. But he did make one promise, looking directly into Lena's devastated eyes. "We will find out who did this to Mateo. I give you my word." It was the kind of promise detectives weren't supposed to make, but he'd been doing this long enough to know that sometimes families needed to hear that someone cared enough to make it personal. Back at the station, digital forensic analysts began the painstaking process of downloading data from Haley's seized phone under the authority of the newly granted warrant. On lines of code and timestamps scrolled across monitors as they extracted messages, call logs, app data, and cached videos. One analyst, a younger woman named Chen who specialized in social media reconstruction, zeroed in on the Snapchat activity. Texts sent at 1:12 a.m., 1:25, 1:39, each one mapped and tagged. Then, critically, a Snapchat video recorded at 1:41 a.m., just 60 seconds before the estimated time of impact. Chen clicked play with the volume low, her headphones on, and watched as the screen filled with the interior of a car. Loud music, laughing voices, the dashboard lights casting a glow across young faces. In the upper corner of the frame, visible through the windshield, was the faint red glow of a traffic signal. A voice off camera, giggling and carefree, said, "You're gonna blow it. Oh, Haley!" Then the video cut off abruptly, as if the phone had been dropped or the app closed in a hurry. Chen replayed it twice more, noting the timestamp, the geolocation data embedded in the file, the perfect alignment with the traffic camera footage from the intersection. She saved the file with meticulous care, knowing this 15-second clip would become one of the most damning pieces of evidence in the case. The investigation had moved from suspicion to certainty in less than 24 hours, the kind of speed that only happened when evidence lined up with brutal clarity. Mills compiled everything into a case file that grew thicker by the hour: witness statements, traffic camera footage, the Snapchat video, photos of the damaged Lexus, lab requests for blood analysis and toxicology. He knew they had enough for an arrest warrant. Enough to bring Haley Knox in and force her to answer questions under the weight of facts she couldn't deny. The prosecutor assigned to the case, a sharp woman named Victoria Reyes, who had a reputation for holding powerful people accountable, reviewed the file and gave Mills the green light to proceed. They both knew this case would attract attention, that the disparity between the victim's family and the suspect's family would turn it into something bigger than just another traffic fatality. But that didn't change the evidence, and the evidence was ironclad. The system was slow and imperfect, but sometimes, when everything aligned, it actually worked the way it was supposed to. The chapter ended on a split screen of contrasts that captured the emotional divide at the heart of the case. On one side, the forensic lab monitor replayed the Snapchat video in a loop, Haley's face half lit by dashboard lights, her lips curled into that same smirk she would wear in court, the soundtrack of laughter and music playing over and over. On the other side, the Torres family laptop sat open to an old video of Mateo playing guitar at a school talent show, his fingers moving across the strings, his smile genuine and unguarded as he sang a song about hope. One video captured a life in progress, a moment of joy preserved forever. The other captured the seconds before a life was taken, a moment of recklessness that could never be undone. Both teens thought they were just recording another ordinary night, moments meant to be forgotten or shared, and then disappeared. Only one of those nights would ever end. The other had become evidence, a digital ghost that would haunt a courtroom and force a community to decide what justice looked like when privilege collided with consequence at a crosswalk in the dark. With enough probable cause built on vehicle damage, digital evidence, and the alignment of witness statements, Mills obtained a warrant for Haley's arrest from a judge who barely hesitated after reviewing the case file. At dusk, 2 days after the collision, patrol cars once again pulled up to the Knox home, this time with their lights off but their presence unmistakable in the quiet suburban street. Neighbors peered through curtains, sensing that something significant was unfolding, phones already in hand to capture whatever came next. Haley watched from a front window on the second floor, her stomach dropping as she saw Detective Mills step out of an unmarked sedan. His face set in the expression of someone about to deliver news that would change everything. When the officers approached the door and her father answered, they told him in clear, formal language that Haley was being arrested in connection with the fatal incident at Maple and 7th. Before anyone could finish explaining her rights, Haley blurted out from behind her father, "It was an accident. I didn't mean to." The words tumbled out in a rush of panic, an admission offered before anyone had even asked a question. Mills made a note of it in his head, and the officer beside him made a note of it on paper. Spontaneous statement, no prompting, immediate acknowledgement of involvement. At the station, Haley was processed through the intake system with the mechanical efficiency of a well-worn procedure. Fingerprints rolled across a scanner, mugshot taken from 2 angles, personal belongings cataloged and placed in a plastic bin. The contrast between her world and this world was striking in every detail. Her designer leggings with the subtle logo stitched into the waistband, her manicured nails that caught the fluorescent light, the expensive sneakers that cost more than some people's monthly grocery budget, all of it looked absurdly out of place against the stark cinder-block walls and metal furniture bolted to the floor. She was led to an interview room that smelled like industrial cleaner, and fear, a space designed to be uncomfortable where the temperature was always slightly too cold and the chairs never quite stable. When offered water, she scoffed and said, "I'm fine. This is stupid." Her demeanor read as irritation at an inconvenience rather than fear of a homicide charge, the body language of someone still convinced this was all a misunderstanding that would be cleared up once the right people got involved. Mills and a juvenile officer sat across from her at the metal table, recording devices activated and positioned where she could see them. A deliberate reminder that every word now mattered in ways it hadn't before. They began gently, asking where she was the previous night, who she was with, what time she got home. Haley's story shifted subtly with each question, the kind of inconsistencies that happen when someone is trying to remember a lie instead of just recounting the truth. First, she said she got home at midnight. She then revised it to 1 o'clock when pressed about the timeline. She initially named 2 friends in the car, then caught herself and added a third when Mills mentioned they'd already spoken to witnesses. She insisted she didn't drink much, then immediately backtracked and claimed she drank not at all, her eyes darting to the side as she recalibrated her story in real time. Each contradiction was a small crack in her defense, making room for the truth to seep in, whether she wanted it to or not. Mills slid a still image from the traffic camera across the table, the photo printed on glossy paper that caught the overhead light. It showed the white SUV frozen mid-motion through the intersection, the timestamp clear in the corner, the blurred figure of a person visible in the crosswalk. Haley's eyes locked onto the photo, her breath catching for just a second before she forced herself to look away, her jaw tightening in a way that suggested she was working very hard to control her expression. When asked if that was her family's vehicle, she reluctantly nodded, then immediately added that everyone has white SUVs, as if the ubiquity of the vehicle could somehow create reasonable doubt. Mills calmly replied that the damage pattern on her car matched debris recovered from the scene, and that traces of blood found on the hood were being tested for DNA. The air in the room changed at the mention of blood, Haley's face going pale as the reality settled in. She tried to pivot, her voice rising slightly. "If it was me, I didn't see him. It was dark. He shouldn't have been in the road." The statement was telling, not a denial of being there, but an attempt to shift blame to the victim who had been exactly where he was supposed to be. As the pressure mounted, her posture shifted from defensive denial to something that looked more like rehearsed regret. She whispered, tears finally forming but not quite falling. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone. It was an accident, I swear." The words had the cadence of something practiced, as if she'd been preparing this line in her head since the moment she realized the police had found her. Mills listened without interrupting, his expression neutral, giving her space to fill with more words that might reveal more truth. He asked a simple question, his voice even and unrushed. "After the impact, did you stop your vehicle?" Haley was silent, her fingers picking at her thumbnail in a nervous habit she couldn't suppress, on her eyes fixed on the table. Then, almost imperceptibly, she shook her head. That admission, fleeing the scene, hardened the potential charges considerably. In the law, sometimes what you do after matters as much as what you did before, and choosing to leave a dying person in the street spoke to a consciousness of guilt that no amount of tears could erase. Robert and Elaine arrived at the station with Mark Ellison, a private defense attorney whose reputation preceded him in sleek Italian shoes and a briefcase that probably cost more than the annual salary of the officers in the building. Ellison was known for handling high-profile clients, for turning courtrooms into theaters where he performed reasonable doubt with the skill of someone who'd done it 100 times. He immediately halted the interview, citing Haley's rights with the practiced ease of someone who knew every angle of juvenile law and instructed her not to answer any more questions. In the hallway outside the interview room, he chastised Mills for what he called aggressive questioning of a minor without proper counsel, despite the fact that every procedure had been followed to the letter. The tension between justice and influence surfaced visibly in that hallway. Ellison's expensive suit versus Mills's off-rack blazer, private practice versus public service, the language of protection versus the language of accountability. Haley watched through the window of the interview room, and as she observed her attorney taking control, her expression hardened back into something resembling that defiant half-smile, all the mask slipping back into place now that reinforcements had arrived. The next morning, the district attorney's office held a press conference on the courthouse steps, reporters crowding around the podium with microphones and cameras. Victoria Reyes stood behind a cluster of microphones, flanked by Detective Mills and the Chief of Police, and announced that Haley Knox would be charged as an adult with vehicular homicide, leaving the scene of a fatal collision and driving under the influence. The decision to charge her as an adult was controversial, guaranteed to ignite debate, but Reyes explained the factors: the severity of the crime, the deliberate flight from the scene, the pattern of behavior suggesting consciousness of guilt, and the defendant's age of 17 being close enough to adulthood that the law allowed for discretion. Local news picked up the story within minutes, juxtaposing Haley's smiling yearbook photo with the somber image of Mateo in his graduation cap and gown. The contrast was stark and deliberate, a visual editorial that captured the public's growing outrage. Online comments erupted across social media platforms, thousands of strangers weighing in with rage over her apparent lack of remorse and her parents' attempts to shield her from consequences. The Torres family watched the announcement on their living room television, the volume turned up so they could hear every word over the ambient noise of relatives gathered in the house. When Reyes read Haley's name and the charges, Lena began to cry quietly. Not tears of joy, but tears of exhausted relief that something was finally happening, that the system was at least moving forward. Rafael reached over and took her hand, squeezing it tightly as they listened to Reyes describe their son's death in clinical legal language that stripped away all the warmth and humanity he'd carried. It was surreal to hear Mateo reduced to the victim and the deceased, terms that felt too impersonal for someone who used to call home every Sunday and send funny memes to his siblings. But they understood this was how justice worked, that to hold someone accountable, their son had to first become evidence, a name in a case file, a story told by strangers. It wasn't the ending they wanted, but it was the only one available, and so they clung to it with both hands. The chapter ended with the image of an arrest warrant being stamped with the word "filed" in bold red letters, the sound of the stamp hitting paper echoing like a gavel. The camera cut to two parallel scenes unfolding simultaneously in different parts of the city. On one side, Haley was being led down a hallway in an orange jumpsuit, her wrists and ankles in shackles that clinked softly with each step, her face turned away from the cameras, but her profile still captured in the harsh lighting. On the other side, Mateo's casket was being carried down the center aisle of a church packed with mourners, pallbearers moving in careful, synchronized steps, the weight of the polished wood heavy on their shoulders. Both were processions, both were consequences of that night at Maple and 7th, but only one involved someone who could still look around and react. As the camera focused on Haley's face for just a moment, the viewers could see the flicker of that smirk trying to return when she noticed the media cameras, a reflex she couldn't fully suppress even in shackles. The echo line landed with weight. Even in chains, she believed she could control the story, but stories written in blood don't care who's telling them. The narrative stepped back to explore the architecture of Haley's upbringing, the foundation upon which her belief in invincibility had been carefully constructed, brick by brick, over 17 years. She grew up in a large home in one of Belridge's most affluent neighborhoods, the kind of house with a circular driveway, professionally maintained landscaping, and rooms that existed just for appearance rather than function. Her parents, Robert and Elaine, were self-made successes who had clawed their way up from middle-class backgrounds. And they prided themselves on giving her opportunities we never had, a phrase they repeated often as justification for every indulgence. But somewhere in their determination to provide, they had confused giving her everything with teaching her anything. Discipline became something other parents did to other children. Consequences were problems that money and influence could make disappear. Teachers at the private schools she attended recalled a girl who could charm administrators with practiced smiles and intimidate peers with the unspoken threat of her father's reach. When she was caught cheating on a chemistry exam in her sophomore year, the incident quietly disappeared after a meeting between the principal, a lawyer, and a generous donation that funded a new science wing. The teacher who reported the cheating was encouraged to reconsider her interpretation of the evidence, and Haley learned once again that problems weren't solved. They were paid away. Childhood stories revealed how small seeds of entitlement took root in soil that should have been firmer. Tantrums in toy stores resulted in whatever she was screaming for, parents too exhausted or embarrassed to hold the boundary. Rude comments to teachers were excused as precociousness or just her strong personality, language that reframed cruelty as confidence. By middle school, Haley already possessed a reputation among staff as someone who got away with behavior that would earn other students detention or suspension. She developed a private joke with her close friends. and calling herself Haley the Untouchable whenever a teacher backed down from a confrontation or a rule was bent in her favor. The phrase was meant as humor, something to laugh about in group chats and bathroom conversations. But like most jokes, it carried a shard of truth that cut deeper than anyone acknowledged. Each small victory over authority reinforced the belief that she existed in a different category than her peers, that the normal rules of cause and effect somehow didn't apply to her life. The question viewers were invited to consider was how many little moments of unchecked arrogance it took to build toward a disaster, and whether anyone along the way could have changed the trajectory if they'd just said no, and meant it. Haley's social media presence painted a curated portrait of a life lived without friction or consequence. On every post carefully filtered to project an image of effortless superiority. Her Instagram feed was a gallery of designer outfits posed in front of exotic locations, rooftop parties with city skylines as backdrops, captions dripping with casual arrogance about living above the drama and being too blessed to be stressed. In Snapchat threads later recovered by investigators during the digital forensic examination, she bragged openly about dodging another ticket after being pulled over for speeding, posting a selfie with puffy eyes and the caption, "Crying works every time." There were multiple references to driving under the influence scattered across months of messages, treated not as dangerous behavior, but as amusing anecdotes. "We're fine. I drive better with White Claw courage," followed by laughing emojis. So these digital breadcrumbs became crucial in shaping public perception of her mindset before the crash. Evidence that her recklessness wasn't a one-time lapse in judgment, but a pattern of behavior enabled by a system that had never forced her to face real stakes. They countered any attempt her defense would later make to paint her as naive or unaware of risk, because her own words told a different story. A court-appointed psychologist conducted a mandatory evaluation as part of the process of determining whether Haley should be tried as a juvenile or an adult, spending several hours with her in a clinical setting designed to strip away performance and access something closer to truth. The report, later summarized in legal filings and leaked to the press, noted patterns consistent with narcissistic traits: inflated sense of self-importance, lack of empathy for others, tendency to externalize blame and view herself as the victim in situations where she was clearly the aggressor. When asked directly about Mateo's death during the evaluation, Haley reportedly responded with a statement that would haunt her through trial. "It's sad, but my life is ruined too." The psychologist noted that she expressed more distress about being in jail and missing school events, specifically homecoming and a friend's birthday party, than about the irreversible loss she had caused. Her emotional landscape appeared to revolve entirely around how events affected her, with little genuine consideration for the Torres family or the finality of what she had taken from them. These observations would later reinforce Judge Cole's perception of her character and play a significant role in sentencing considerations. The Bell Ridge community split along uncomfortable fault lines as the case gained local and then regional attention, the divisions revealing deeper tensions about class, privilege, and accountability. Some residents insisted she was just a kid who made a mistake, arguing that one terrible decision shouldn't define an entire life, that the purpose of juvenile justice was rehabilitation rather than punishment. Others demanded the maximum possible sentence, pointing to her behavior after the crash and her apparent lack of genuine remorse as evidence that leniency would only reinforce the lesson that wealth could buy freedom from consequence. At Bell Ridge High, students hung posters reading "Justice for Mateo" in hallways and organized a memorial walk to the intersection where he died, hundreds of teens carrying candles and wearing shirts with his face printed on them. But a smaller, quieter group whispered in bathrooms and parking lots that Haley was being targeted because of who her dad is, that the media was turning her into a villain to sell a narrative. Social media debates raged across platforms, arguments spiraling into accusations and counter-accusations about privilege, justice, and whether a 17-year-old brain was developed enough to fully grasp the weight of vehicular homicide. While the Knox family hired public relations consultants to manage their image and craft statements about their daughter's character. The Torres family struggled with funeral bills that insurance barely covered and the psychological toll of grief that arrived in waves without warning. Lena developed severe insomnia, lying awake night after night, replaying the phone call from the hospital, wondering in the spiral of exhausted thoughts if saying no to that extra shift could have saved her son. Raphael returned to his construction job because bills didn't stop for morning, but he couldn't finish a full day without breaking down in private, crying in his truck during lunch breaks where no one could see. The younger siblings stopped riding their bikes at dusk, terrified of crossing streets even with their parents present, their sense of safety shattered by the knowledge that doing everything right sometimes wasn't enough. Their world had shrunk to the size of their fear, and every intersection now a potential threat, while across town the Knox family worked with attorneys and consultants to expand Haley's options and soften her public image. The disparity was impossible to ignore, two families experiencing the same tragedy from opposite sides of a divide built on economics and access. In a press conference that drew significant media attention, the district attorney announced the controversial decision to proceed with trying Haley as an adult, a move that required judicial approval and carried enormous implications for her potential sentence. He stood behind the podium with the measured authority of someone who had anticipated the backlash and prepared for it, citing the severity of the crime, her behavior in the immediate aftermath, patterns of prior reckless conduct, and her proximity to legal adulthood at 17 years and 11 months old. He referenced her lack of remorse as documented by officers, psychologists, and even her own social media activity. The decision ignited immediate protest on both sides. Supporters of the Torres family gathered outside the courthouse with signs reading, "Adult crimes deserve adult time," while defenders of Haley organized counter-protests arguing, "She's still a child." Mark Ellison, her attorney, condemned the decision in a statement dripping with calculated outrage, accusing the DA of political theater and ruining a child's life for headlines and re-election. The battle lines were drawn not just in the courtroom, but in the court of public opinion, where every detail would be dissected and debated by strangers who had never met either teenager but felt entitled to judge them both. The chapter ended with a powerful visual contrast that captured the fundamental imbalance at the heart of the case. On one side, Judge Cole's desk in her chambers, stacked neatly with legal briefs and case files, the Knox file placed squarely in the center under the light of a brass desk lamp. On the other side, a cluttered homework desk in Mateo's untouched bedroom, textbooks still open to the pages he had been studying the night he died, a pencil resting in the margin where he'd been taking notes. One set of papers held the power to define punishment, to measure justice in years and restrictions and the architecture of consequence. The other held the plans of a life cut short, equations left unsolved, or essays left unfinished, a future that existed now only in the past tense. The echo line delivered the weight of that imbalance. One teenager's future was frozen in time, preserved only in photographs and memories and the things he would never get to finish. The others would now be decided by 12 strangers and a judge who had seen too many smirks to believe this one was anything but deliberate. Haley's first formal court appearance took place in a small, wood-paneled courtroom that felt too cramped for the number of people trying to squeeze into its benches. The room was packed with media representatives, community members who had followed the case obsessively online, and legal observers curious to see how a high-profile juvenile case tried as adult would unfold. She arrived in a county-issue orange jumpsuit that hung loose on her frame, but she walked with a posture that suggested she was stepping onto a stage rather than into a legal proceeding that would determine the rest of her life. As the charges were read aloud by the clerk, vehicular homicide, driving under the influence, leaving the scene of a fatal collision. She glanced back toward the gallery, her eyes scanning faces as if checking attendance at a school assembly. The Torres family sat rigidly in the front row, Lena clutching the now familiar framed photograph of Mateo propped against a box of tissues. Raphael's hand gripping hers so tightly, both their knuckles had gone white. When someone's phone accidentally went off with a pop song ringtone, the brief moment of levity seemed to touch Haley's face, her lips twitching into an inappropriate flicker of amusement that several reporters noted in their notebooks, and at least 2 cameras captured in unflattering clarity. The bond hearing that followed became a battleground for competing narratives about who Haley Knox actually was beneath the designer clothes and carefully managed image. Her attorney, Mark Ellison, argued aggressively for reasonable bond, his voice rising with practiced indignation as he cited her age, her lack of prior criminal record, and what he called strong family support. He painted her as an honor student who volunteered at local animal shelters and organized charity drives at school, someone whose entire life would be derailed by pretrial detention. He showed the judge certificates of achievement, letters from teachers praising her intelligence, and photographs of her smiling with rescue dogs as if compassion toward animals could somehow erase the fact that she had left a human being to bleed out in a crosswalk. The prosecution countered with evidence that told a very different story. Traffic camera footage showing the SUV never slowing, phone records documenting her activities after the crash, witness statements about drinking and reckless driving. They emphasized her behavior after impact, the deliberate flight, the attempt to clean the vehicle, the lies told to officers during initial questioning. The question wasn't whether she was a flight risk in the traditional sense, but whether she understood the gravity of having taken a life, and whether releasing her sent a message that wealth could purchase temporary freedom, even from the most serious charges. As the attorneys debated her character and her risk level, cameras positioned throughout the courtroom captured Haley's body language in ways that would later be analyzed frame by frame on true crime forums and cable news panels. She leaned back in her seat with a casualness that read as disrespect, twirling a strand of hair that had escaped her ponytail, whispering comments to her lawyer that occasionally made him frown and shake his head slightly. At one point, when the prosecutor described her as callous and demonstrating a shocking lack of remorse, she let out a short, derisive laugh that wasn't quite loud enough to interrupt, but was clearly audible on the microphones. Judge Cole's head snapped up, her eyes locking onto Haley with a look of visible displeasure that made several people in the gallery inhale sharply. "Miss Knox," she said, her voice cutting through the courtroom with the precision of a blade. "This is not a joke. You will control your facial expressions and your reactions, or I will have you removed from this proceeding, and we will continue without you." For just a second, Haley's mask slipped completely, revealing a flash of genuine anger at being publicly corrected, her jaw tightening and her eyes narrowing before she forced her features back into something closer to neutral boredom. In an unusual move that drew objections from the defense, the prosecution requested that Lena Torres be allowed to make a brief statement regarding bond, arguing that the court should hear from the victim's family about the impact of releasing the defendant. Judge Cole considered the request carefully, then permitted it with the caveat that it must be limited in scope and focused on the bond decision rather than the merits of the case. Lena stood slowly, her hands trembling as she gripped the edge of the wooden podium, still holding the photograph of her son like a talisman. She spoke softly, but with a firmness born of unimaginable pain, describing in careful, measured words how she had identified her son's body at the hospital, how every night since she woke up reaching for a child who wasn't there, how the empty chair at their dinner table felt like a black hole pulling all the air from the room. "She left him in the road like he was nothing," Lena said, her voice breaking slightly but holding steady, her eyes moving to find Haley's across the courtroom. If she can walk free while my son is in the ground, what does that say about what his life was worth? Haley avoided direct eye contact, her jaw set, her lips pressed together in what looked like an attempt to suppress that ever-present smirk, but not quite succeeding. After a long pause, during which Judge Cole reviewed documents and appeared to weigh competing interests, she delivered her ruling on bond. She set it extraordinarily high, $500,000, with strict conditions that included house arrest, monitored by ankle bracelet, mandatory alcohol monitoring, surrender of passport, and a prohibition on driving any vehicle. However, citing legal standards about pretrial detention and the presumption of innocence, she allowed for release if the bond could be posted. The Torres family was visibly devastated, Lena's shoulders shaking with quiet sobs as Rafael wrapped his arm around her, both of them processing the decision as evidence that the system inherently favored defendants with resources. Outside the courthouse, protesters who had gathered on both sides of the case erupted in competing chants. No bond for killers, clashing with kids deserve second chances, the divide in the community playing out in real time on the courthouse steps. The question that would follow the case through every subsequent hearing was whether this was leniency or simply the way the law was designed to work, and whether the answer to that question depended entirely on which side of the economic divide you stood. Leaving the courthouse later that afternoon, after her parents posted the bond in cash, Haley walked quickly between her attorney and her father, surrounded by a protective bubble of expensive legal representation. She had changed back into street clothes, designer jeans, a fitted jacket, sunglasses despite the overcast sky, and moved with the tight, controlled energy of someone aware that every camera was watching. A reporter from a local news station shouted over the noise of the crowd, "Do you have anything to say to the Torres family?" The question hung in the air for just a moment, and Haley's mouth twitched into that familiar expression, half smirk and half sneer. Under her breath, barely audible but caught clearly on at least one camera mic positioned close enough, she muttered, "Not to vultures." The comment was clearly directed at the press, but the optics were catastrophic. Within hours, the clip went viral across social media platforms, viewed millions of times. Dissected and captioned and turned into memes that accused her of mocking not just journalists, but the entire process, and by extension, the family of the boy she had killed. Mark Ellison went into immediate damage control mode, releasing a statement insisting that Haley had been overwhelmed by the aggressive media presence and that her words were taken out of context and do not reflect her true feelings about this tragedy. He claimed she was referring only to intrusive reporters and not to the victim's family, a distinction that felt meaningless to the thousands of people commenting online with variations of outrage and disgust. The incident became a perfect encapsulation of the prosecution's argument, that Haley's instinct under pressure was always to deflect, to see herself as the victim, to prioritize her own comfort over accountability. True crime podcasters analyzed the moment in excruciating detail, comparing her body language to other high-profile defendants who had damaged their cases through arrogance. The court of public opinion had already reached a verdict, and it was guilty on all counts of being exactly the entitled teenager everyone suspected she was. A few days later, an old social media post resurfaced, shared by a former friend who had grown disgusted by Haley's behavior and felt compelled to contribute to the growing digital record. It was a Snapchat video from months before the crash, recorded in the front seat of a car at night, Haley's face illuminated by the dashboard lights as she laughed and declared, "I'm unstoppable, baby. Nothing can touch me." The phrase untouchable was overlaid on the footage in glittery font, complete with a crown emoji floating above her head like a halo of arrogance. As the clip circulated in connection with the case, public anger spiked to new levels. the juxtaposition of her boast against the reality of Mateo's death in a crosswalk too perfect and too painful. The district attorney's office quietly added the clip to their evidence file, not as direct proof of the crime itself, but as powerful context for sentencing, a window into the mindset that had made the crash not just possible, but perhaps inevitable. The chapter ended with the screen frozen on that Snapchat frame, Haley's face half lit and smiling, the glittery crown slightly askew, and foreshadowing a very different kind of crown, the state seal hanging behind a judge's bench, that would soon hover over her in a very different context. The final visual closed on parallel images that captured the fundamental divide at the heart of the case. On one side, Haley at home on house arrest, sitting on an expensive couch in her family's living room, ankle monitor blinking red every few seconds as she scrolled through angry comments about herself on her phone, her face illuminated by the cold glow of the screen. On the other side, Lena at Mateo's grave in a quiet cemetery, kneeling on the grass, tracing his name on the polished granite headstone with her fingertips, as if the gesture could somehow reach him. Both women were trapped in new realities constructed by that night at Maple and 7th. One by legal restrictions she resented, the other by grief she would carry forever. The echo line delivered the final weight. One wore her sentence like uncomfortable jewelry, counting the days until she could take it off. The other carried hers like a stone in her chest, knowing there would never be relief, never be parole, never be a moment when the weight lifted and let her breathe free again. In the months leading up to trial, the prosecution team worked with the meticulous intensity of architects, building a structure that couldn't afford a single weak beam. They assembled a timeline of the night with obsessive precision, tracking every movement, every decision, every missed opportunity for Haley to change course. Bar receipts from a liquor store showed a purchase made by an older friend at 10:15 in the evening. The items matching the empty cans found in the SUV cell tower pings mapped her phone's journey through the city, creating a digital trail that aligned perfectly with witness accounts. Traffic footage from multiple intersections captured the white Lexus at various points throughout the night, speeds estimated by measuring distance between frames. Witness statements were cross-referenced and verified, inconsistencies resolved, timelines tightened until there was no gap large enough for doubt to slip through. A massive whiteboard in the district attorney's conference room displayed the evening in linear progression. 10:15 pregame at a friend's house, 11:30 leaving for another location, 12:45 driving erratically through downtown, 1:41 Snapchat recording, 1:42 impact. Every minute accounted for, every choice documented, the narrative of the night reduced to data points that transformed her claim of just a tragic accident into a preventable catastrophe built on a foundation of deliberate recklessness. Lab reports finally returned from the state forensics facility, and the results removed any remaining ambiguity about Haley's condition at the time of the crash. Her blood, drawn several hours after the collision during her initial processing, revealed a blood alcohol content of 0.11, well above the legal limit for adults and astronomically beyond any acceptable level for a minor. Traces of THC were also detected in her system, suggesting she had been under multiple influences that compounded her impairment. But her attorney immediately argued that the time delay between the crash and the blood draw made the exact level at the moment of impact speculative, that metabolism rates varied and extrapolation was inherently unreliable. The prosecution countered with expert testimony they were preparing, toxicologists who would explain to a jury how to calculate backward using established elimination rates, demonstrating that, even accounting for the most generous estimates, she had been dangerously intoxicated. The science became another anchor pulling the narrative away from bad luck and toward predictable outcome, transforming the crash from an unfortunate accident into the logical endpoint of choices that began hours before her car ever reached that intersection. A crash reconstruction expert visited Maple and 7th multiple times over several weeks, measuring distances with laser precision, documenting sight lines from every angle, analyzing lighting conditions at the exact time of night the collision occurred. Using sophisticated software that combined physics with photography, they created a digital simulation showing the SUV's approximate speed, estimated at 47 miles per hour, in a zone posted at 30, at the moment it ran the red light. The model demonstrated with cold, mathematical certainty that a sober, attentive driver traveling at the legal speed limit could have seen Mateo entering the crosswalk and had sufficient time and distance to brake completely. The simulation could be slowed down, paused, viewed from multiple angles, each perspective reinforcing the same conclusion. This wasn't about visibility or reaction time or an unavoidable accident. No braking occurred until after impact, if at all, the physical evidence at the scene showing uninterrupted acceleration through the collision. This animation would later be played in court on a large screen, forcing jurors to watch the preventable tragedy unfold in sterile digital precision. The stick figure representation of Mateo somehow making it more universal and therefore more devastating. Forensic analysts spent weeks mapping out Haley's digital footprint from inside the vehicle, reconstructing not just where she was, but what she was doing moment by moment. Music streaming data showed songs being changed frequently, the kind of distracted scrolling that indicated eyes on a phone rather than the road. Text messages were sent while the vehicle was in motion, the timestamps and GPS data proving she was typing while driving at speeds above 40 miles per hour. Multiple Snapchats were recorded throughout the evening, the app's metadata revealing not just when they were created, but the location and even the movement speed of the device. The final video, recorded at 1:41 in the morning, became the centerpiece of the digital evidence. Enhanced audio analysis revealed a friend's voice in the background saying, "We're gonna run it, aren't we?" followed by laughter that suggested this wasn't concern but entertainment. Seconds after the clip ended, the phone's internal sensors recorded a sudden, violent jolt consistent with a high-speed collision, followed immediately by sustained acceleration. Most damning of all, there was no 911 call from her phone that night, no text indicating concern about what she'd hit. Just continued private messages that included phrases like, "OMG, that bump though," and "I think we're okay." The subtext was inescapable. She knew something significant had happened and made a conscious choice not to confront it. Meanwhile, Haley's defense team worked to construct a counter-narrative that emphasized youth, panic, and the absence of malicious intent. They planned to argue that intersection lighting was inadequate, potentially creating dangerous conditions that contributed to the collision. They retained experts to critique the reliability of traffic cameras, questioning whether low-resolution footage could definitively identify vehicle details. Another expert was prepared to testify about the possibility of pre-existing brake issues with the Lexus, suggesting mechanical failure rather than driver negligence. They compiled character references and academic achievements, building a portrait of a young woman with potential who had made one catastrophic mistake but shouldn't have her entire future erased. Quietly, behind closed doors, they also continued to push for a plea deal, hoping that the district attorney might be willing to reduce charges to avoid the uncertainty of trial. But public pressure and the Torres family's insistence on full accountability kept negotiations minimal and tense, neither side willing to give ground on what justice should look like in a case that had become about so much more than just one collision. The prosecution met with the Torres family in a conference room that smelled like coffee and stress, preparing them for what trial would entail. Victoria Reyes explained with careful gentleness that they would be required to view graphic photographs of the scene, listen to technical testimony about Mateo's injuries, and potentially watch the digital reconstruction of his final moments. Lena physically flinched at the idea, her hand flying to her chest as if she could protect her heart from the images that were coming. Raphael's face hardened, his jaw setting in that familiar way that meant he was pushing down emotions too large to express safely. But they both nodded, agreeing that if they could survive the phone call, the hospital visit, the funeral where they buried their son in a suit he'd worn to his senior prom, if they could survive this too, their presence in the courtroom would become its own form of testimony, a silent but powerful reminder to the jury that behind every legal term and piece of evidence was a family whose world had been shattered, a mother who would never stop reaching for a son who wasn't there. 1 week before trial was scheduled to begin, the district attorney made a final strategic offer, the kind of deal that reflected both the strength of their case and a pragmatic acknowledgement that trials carried inherent risks. They proposed that Haley accept a plea to reduce charges, vehicular manslaughter, and leaving the scene, with a fixed sentence of 10 years in state prison, eligibility for parole after serving 85%. Mark Ellison presented the offer to Haley and her parents in a private meeting at his office. On laying out the mathematics of risk, accept the deal and know the outcome with certainty, or go to trial where a conviction on the original charges could result in 25 years or more. He urged her to consider it seriously, explaining in blunt terms that juries didn't respond well to defendants who appeared arrogant or unremorseful, and that her behavior so far hadn't exactly generated sympathy. Haley listened, her arms crossed, her expression cycling between fear and defiance. Finally, she scoffed and said, 10 years? I'll be like almost 30 when I get out. My life would be over. Her parents, still clinging to the belief that a jury would see their daughter as they saw her, misunderstood rather than malicious, supported her decision to reject the plea. Against all professional advice, buoyed by privilege that had always bent reality in their favor before, they turned down the deal. The chapter ended with Victoria Reyes closing the file on plea negotiations, her expression neutral but her voice carrying an edge of finality as she stated, "We'll see her in court." The final image juxtaposed two calendars that captured the radically different ways the same date was being anticipated. On one side, Haley's personal calendar, probably on her phone or in a planner her mother bought to help her stay organized during this difficult time, where the trial date was circled in red marker with a notation beside it. Court, followed by an eye-roll emoji, as if it were an annoying dentist appointment rather than a proceeding that would determine whether she spent the next decades in prison. On the other side, Lena's kitchen calendar, the kind with photographs of inspirational quotes, where every single day since Mateo's death was marked with a small black dot, grief quietly recorded in ink that would never fade. Some days had additional notes. Funeral would have been his birthday. First day of classes he'll never take. The trial date was circled multiple times, the pen pressed so hard it had nearly torn through the paper, the weight of anticipation and dread visible in the physical pressure. One mark anticipated an event to be endured and hopefully forgotten. The other marked a continuation of a sentence that had no end date, no possibility of parole, no moment when the pain would be declared served and she could return to the life she had before. The echo line delivered the weight of that choice. She turned down 10 years, uncertain the system would bend the way it always had. Instead, she had just closed the door on the last exit before the machinery of justice ground forward, indifferent to privilege, deaf to excuses, and determined to answer a question the community desperately needed answered. What happens when untouchable finally meets immovable? On the first day of trial, the courthouse buzzed with an energy that felt almost electric, the kind of anticipation that came when a case transcended local news and became something larger, a referendum on privilege and accountability that people across the region had been following for months. Reporters set up cameras in designated areas, their equipment creating a maze of tripods and cables. True crime enthusiasts who had been following every development online lined up before dawn to claim seats in the public gallery, some having driven hours for the chance to witness the proceedings in person. Legal staff ferried boxes of files and evidence through secured hallways, their movements choreographed by months of preparation. Haley arrived in a carefully chosen outfit, a tailored navy blazer over a cream blouse, minimal jewelry. Her hair styled neatly, but not too perfectly, makeup applied to suggest youth and vulnerability rather than the confidence she'd projected in her social media posts. Every detail had been debated with her legal team, an attempt to present a version of herself that might generate sympathy or at least reduce the reflexive disgust many potential jurors might feel. The Torres family walked in together as they always did, holding hands in a chain of connection. Mateo's photograph clutched to Lena's chest like a shield against a world that had become incomprehensibly cruel. Judge Meredith Cole took the bench precisely on time, her black robe flowing as she moved with the authority of someone who had presided over enough trials to know that justice was messy and imperfect, but necessary. Her gavel tapped once, the sound sharp and final, restoring silence to a room that had been humming with whispered speculation. This was no longer a series of preliminary hearings or bond arguments or procedural motions. This was the main event, the moment where everything would be laid bare, examined, challenged, and ultimately judged by 12 people who had been selected specifically because they claimed they could set aside everything they'd heard and decide based solely on evidence. The weight of that responsibility hung in the air, visible in the serious expressions of the jurors as they filed into the box, their eyes already beginning the process of observation that would define the next several weeks. The jury had been selected after days of painstaking questioning, dozens of potential jurors dismissed for various reasons that revealed the complexity of finding truly impartial people in a case that had saturated local media. Some admitted openly that they'd already formed opinions about Haley's guilt based on news coverage and social media. Others were dismissed for expressing views about drunk driving that were so absolute they couldn't consider nuance or circumstance. A few were excused because they knew someone involved, a friend of the Torres family, a business associate of Robert Knox, the interconnected nature of a mid-sized city, making true anonymity nearly impossible. Eventually, 12 jurors and 2 alternates were sworn in, their faces representing a cross-section of the community. Different ages, backgrounds, professions, and life experiences. They would be the ones to decide not just what happened that night at Maple and 7th, but what it meant, what it said about responsibility and consequence in a society that claimed to value equality before the law. Their eyes frequently drifted to Haley throughout the opening procedures, noting her composure, cataloging small gestures and expressions, beginning the subconscious process of deciding whether she was a remorseful young woman who made a terrible mistake or something darker that needed to be contained. The prosecutor, Victoria Reyes, rose for her opening statement with the controlled energy of someone who had been preparing for this moment for months. She stood before the jury without notes, having memorized every word, every pause, every inflection designed to build a narrative that was both legally precise and emotionally resonant. Her voice was measured but firm as she outlined the case, beginning not with legal elements, but with a simple premise. A bright, promising young man following every rule in a crosswalk designed to protect him, and a teenager who chose speed, alcohol, distraction, and her own convenience over human life. This case is about choices, she said, letting the word hang in the air for a moment. Not just the choice to drink, not just the choice to get behind the wheel impaired, not just the choice to speed through a red light while recording videos on her phone, but the choice, after feeling the impact of a human body against her vehicle, to keep driving, to go home, to try to hide what she'd done, and when confronted, to lie about it. She promised the jury evidence that would leave no room for doubt. Videos showing Haley's state of mind moments before impact, messages revealing her priorities afterward, scientific analysis proving both impairment and the preventability of the collision. Her final line was delivered with quiet intensity. At the end of this trial, we will ask you to hold her accountable in the only language she has never learned: consequences. Mark Ellison's opening statement was a masterclass in walking a careful line between acknowledging reality and sowing seeds of doubt that might take root in even one juror's mind. He began by projecting empathy, his voice softer than Reyes's, his posture more open and less confrontational. He described the collision as a terrible, tragic accident that has devastated two families, careful to include the Knoxes in the circle of suffering, even though the comparison rang hollow to anyone paying attention. He emphasized Haley's lack of intent to harm anyone, the absence of malice or premeditation, painting her as a young person who made a split-second error in judgment, rather than a series of deliberate bad choices. He suggested that the intersection's design and lighting conditions contributed to the collision, hinting that responsibility might be more diffuse than the prosecution wanted the jury to believe. He spoke about panic, about the way fear can override rational decision-making, particularly in a teenage brain not yet fully developed in the regions that control impulse and consequence. At the end of this trial, he told the jury, his eyes moving across their faces, "We believe you'll see that while Haley should be held responsible for her actions, she is not the monster some have painted her to be. She is a 17-year-old girl who made terrible decisions and will live with the weight of this tragedy for the rest of her life, regardless of what happens in this courtroom." As both attorneys spoke, our cameras positioned throughout the courtroom captured Haley's reactions with the unblinking attention that would later fuel hours of analysis on legal commentary shows and true crime podcasts. She alternated between looking attentive, leaning slightly forward, nodding occasionally at her attorney's words, and letting her eyes drift toward the gallery, scanning faces as if searching for friendly ones in a hostile crowd. When Reyes described Mateo's final moments in clinical detail, explaining how he had looked both ways, waited for the signal, trusted the system designed to keep him safe, Haley shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Her lips twitched into that familiar expression, something between a grimace and a smirk, and perhaps from discomfort, or perhaps from habit so deeply ingrained she couldn't suppress it, even when everything depended on appearing remorseful. The jurors noticed. One woman in the front row raised an eyebrow and made a note on the pad she'd been given. Another juror, a middle-aged man in the back, leaned back slightly and crossed his arms, his body language shifting toward skepticism. In the front row of the gallery, Lena whispered to Raphael, her voice barely audible, but her words caught by a nearby reporter. "She's still not taking this seriously." Whether Haley intended that expression or not, her face had become a piece of evidence working against her, a silent testimony to the prosecution's argument that she didn't truly grasp what she had done. The prosecution began calling witnesses immediately after opening statements concluded, starting with the straightforward testimonies designed to establish basic facts before building toward the more emotional and technical evidence. The campus security guard who found Mateo took the stand first, his voice steady, but his hands gripping the witness box edge as he described hearing the impact, running toward the intersection, finding a young man barely breathing in the crosswalk. He testified in clinical, controlled tones about calling 911, about trying to keep Mateo conscious until paramedics arrived, about the helpless feeling of watching someone slip away despite his best efforts. When asked to describe the scene, his voice cracked slightly on the phrase, "There was so much blood," and he paused to compose himself before continuing. The paramedics who responded testified next, their accounts professional and detached in the way of people trained to create emotional distance from tragedy. But emotion seeped through in small ways. The way one paramedic's jaw tightened when describing the severity of injuries. The long pause before another said, "We did everything we could," as if still trying to convince himself it was true. Photos of the scene were introduced into evidence, displayed on large screens positioned so the jury couldn't avoid seeing them. The crosswalk with its white painted lines now stained dark. The scattered textbooks, pages fluttering in captured wind. The messenger bag several feet from where the body had been, its strap torn. when the single shoe lying in the gutter separated from its owner in the violence of impact. Several jurors looked away when the most graphic images appeared, one woman briefly closing her eyes before forcing herself to look again, understanding that bearing witness was part of the responsibility she'd accepted. Haley stared down at the defense table, her face carefully blank, while her parents in the gallery gripped each other's hands so tightly their fingers had gone pale. The courtroom had gone completely silent except for the quiet sound of Lena crying in the front row, tissues pressed to her face, her body shaking with the effort of staying quiet. These were the images that would define the case for the jury, the physical reality of what vehicular homicide meant when stripped of legal abstraction and reduced to the simple, brutal fact of a body broken on pavement. The chapter closed with the prosecutor announcing that in the next session, the jury would see the full traffic camera footage and the digital reconstruction of the collision, warning them that it would be difficult to watch but essential to understanding the sequence of events and the preventability of the tragedy. The jurors exchanged uneasy glances, several shifting in their seats as they braced themselves for what was coming. Mark Ellison leaned over to whisper in Haley's ear, and she nodded, her facial muscles tightening in a way that suggested she was preparing herself for something she'd been dreading. The screen at the front of the courtroom displayed the paused first frame of the intersection at 1:41 in the morning, frozen in the moment before everything changed. I'm about to be set in motion for a room full of strangers to relive and judge. The final visual alternated between that darkened courtroom screen showing the frozen intersection and the Torres family's living room television, where they had once watched public service announcements about traffic safety with their kids, drilling into them the importance of crosswalks and signals and doing everything right. The echo line delivered the chapter's devastating truth. He did everything he was taught to stay alive, every rule followed, every precaution taken. Tomorrow the jury would watch how little that mattered when it met a car that never even tried to stop. On the first day of trial, the courthouse buzzed with an energy that felt almost electric, the kind of tension that builds when a community's anger and grief finally find a focal point. Reporters set up cameras in designated areas, their lenses trained on the entrance where the key players would arrive. True crime enthusiasts who had followed the case obsessively online lined up before dawn to claim the limited public seating, some bringing coffee and snacks as if preparing for a concert rather than a homicide trial. Legal staff ferried boxes of files and evidence through side entrances, their arms stacked with the physical weight of a case that had consumed months of preparation. Haley arrived in a carefully chosen outfit, a tailored navy blazer over a modest blouse, minimal jewelry, hair styled in soft waves that framed her face, every detail selected by her legal team to project innocence and youth. The Torres family walked in together just minutes later, holding hands in a chain of solidarity, Lena clutching Mateo's photograph to her chest in a gesture that had become both ritual and armor. Judge Meredith Cole took the bench promptly at 9, her black robe flowing as she settled into the high-backed chair, and her gavel tapped once with a sound that seemed to draw all the ambient noise out of the room, leaving only focused silence. The process of jury selection had taken days. Dozens of potential jurors questioned about their views on drunk driving, their opinions about teen offenders, their ability to set aside what they'd seen in the media and judge the case only on evidence presented in court. Some admitted honestly that they couldn't be impartial, that they'd already formed opinions too strong to dislodge. Others were dismissed for knowing too much, their exposure to news coverage so extensive that separation between fact and commentary had blurred beyond repair. Eventually, 12 jurors and 2 alternates were sworn in, a group that reflected a cross-section of Belridge, a retired teacher, a grocery store manager, a nurse, an engineer, faces spanning ages and backgrounds, but united now in the enormous responsibility they carried. They would decide not just what happened on that night at Maple and 7th, but what it meant and what should be done about it. Their eyes frequently drifted toward Haley during the preliminary instructions, studying her the way people study puzzles, trying to reconcile the young woman in the blazer with the person described in charging documents who had left a dying teenager in a crosswalk. The prosecutor, Victoria Reyes. I stood and approached the jury box with the measured confidence of someone who had tried hundreds of cases and understood the rhythm of persuasion. Her voice was firm but not aggressive, the tone of someone presenting facts rather than performing outrage. She began by telling them about Mateo Torres, 18 years old, first-generation college student, working part-time to help his family, a young man who followed every rule, checked every signal, did everything society told him would keep him safe. Then she shifted to Haley Knox, 17 years old, driving under multiple influences, speeding through a red light while recording videos on her phone, making a choice in the seconds after impact that defined her character more clearly than any school transcript ever could. "This case is about choices," Reyes said, her words hanging in the air with deliberate weight. Not just the choice to drink, not just the choice to speed, not just the choice to look at a phone instead of the road, but the choice to leave a dying boy bleeding in the street because stopping would have been inconvenient. She promised the jury evidence that would remove all doubt, videos that captured her state of mind, messages that revealed her priorities, scientific analysis that proved impairment and speed. Her final line was delivered with quiet intensity. "At the end of this trial, we will ask you to hold her accountable in the only language she has never learned: consequences." Mark Ellison rose for the defense with the practiced ease of someone who had walked this path many times before, his expensive suit perfectly tailored, his expression calibrated to project both empathy and reasonable doubt. He acknowledged the tragedy immediately, a strategic move meant to humanize his client and demonstrate that the defense wasn't denying pain, only disputing interpretation. He described the crash as a terrible, tragic accident that will haunt everyone involved for the rest of their lives, framing it as something that happened to Haley rather than something she caused. He emphasized her lack of intent to harm anyone, her emotional state of panic after the collision, and the irreversible nature of what had already occurred. He suggested that intersection design and inadequate lighting had contributed to the collision, hinting that responsibility might be shared across multiple parties, including city planning departments. He reminded the jury that the law distinguished between deliberate murder and unintentional tragedy, that while Haley should be held responsible, the question was what kind of responsibility fit the circumstances. "At the end of this trial," he told them, his voice softening to invite them into his perspective, "we believe you'll see that while Haley made mistakes, serious mistakes she will carry forever, she is not the monster some have painted her to be. She is a frightened teenager who made the worst decision of her life in a moment of panic." As both attorneys spoke, cameras positioned discreetly throughout the courtroom captured Haley's reactions in detail that would later be analyzed frame by frame on cable news and true crime podcasts. She alternated between looking attentive, leaning slightly forward, our eyes on the speaker, and letting her focus drift toward the gallery as if searching for familiar faces or simply disengaging from words that made her uncomfortable. When the prosecutor described Mateo's final moments, explaining how he had stood at the crosswalk waiting for the signal like every responsible pedestrian should, Haley shifted in her seat, and for just a fraction of a second, her lips twitched into that familiar half-smile. It might have been nerves, might have been discomfort manifesting in an inappropriate facial expression, but intent didn't matter when optics told a story. Several jurors noticed their eyes narrowing slightly, and one woman in the second row scribbled something in the small notebook they'd been provided. The Torres family, sitting close enough to see Haley's profile, and watched that flicker of expression with a mixture of disbelief and fury, Lena leaning over to whisper to Raphael, "She's still not taking this seriously." The prosecution began calling witnesses with strategic precision, starting with the straightforward and building toward the devastating. The campus security guard who found Mateo testified first, his voice steady, but his hands gripping the witness stand hard enough to show white knuckles. He described hearing the impact from blocks away, the sound distinct and wrong in a way that made him run before his conscious mind understood why. He recounted finding Mateo in the crosswalk, the pooling blood, the shallow breathing that rattled with every exhale, the helpless feeling of watching life drain away while sirens approached too slowly. The paramedics who responded testified next, their clinical language unable to fully mask the emotion beneath when they described injuries incompatible with survival, efforts that proved futile despite their best skills. Photos of the scene were introduced into evidence and displayed on screens throughout the courtroom. The crosswalk with its clear white lines, the scattered textbooks with pages fluttering in the breeze of passing cars, the single shoe lying yards from where Mateo had been thrown, the blood-staining asphalt in patterns that told the story of impact and death. Several jurors looked away when the most graphic images were shown, hands rising to cover mouths, eyes closing briefly before forcing themselves to look again because looking was their duty. Haley stared at the defense table during the photographs, her expression unreadable. I carefully maintained neutrality that might have been dissociation or might have been strategy. Her parents sat directly behind her in the front row of the gallery, hands clasped together tightly, faces drawn with stress that had aged them visibly over the months since the arrest. When one particularly graphic image of the scene appeared on screen, a wide shot showing the full scope of the collision's aftermath, Elaine Knox put her hand over her mouth and closed her eyes, unable or unwilling to look at what her daughter had driven away from. The contrast in the courtroom was stark. On one side, the Torres family forcing themselves to witness every detail of their son's final moments, treating it as an obligation of love and memory. On the other side, on the Knox family averting their eyes from the consequences of choices made by someone they'd raised, protected, and enabled. The jury saw all of it, the silent theater of reactions that spoke as loudly as any testimony. The prosecutor announced that in the next session, scheduled to begin the following morning, the jury would view the complete traffic camera footage and the digital reconstruction of the collision. He warned them that it would be difficult to watch but essential to understanding the sequence of events, the choices made and not made, the seconds that separated tragedy from safety. The jurors exchanged uneasy glances, several shifting in their seats, bracing themselves for images they knew would be impossible to forget. Haley's attorney leaned close and whispered in her ear, his hand gesturing slightly as if coaching her on how to react, and she nodded, her facial muscles tightening in what looked like preparation to maintain composure through something unpleasant. Judge Cole reminded everyone that court would reconvene at 9 the next morning and dismissed them with instructions not to discuss the case or consume any media coverage. As people filed out, the weight of what was coming hung heavy in the air, the sense that they had only reached the edge of the truly difficult testimony that the worst was still ahead. The chapter closed with a visual that captured the anticipation and dread in equal measure. On one side, the darkened courtroom after everyone had left, chairs empty, even the large screen at the front of the room displaying only a paused frame from the traffic camera. The intersection at 1:41 in the morning, frozen in the moment before everything changed. On the other side, the Torres family home where that evening Lena and Rafael sat together on the couch, the television off, just holding each other in silence as they prepared mentally for the next day when they would watch their son die in digital recreation. The echo line tied the images together with devastating simplicity. He did everything he was taught to stay alive, looked both ways, waited for the signal, trusted that the rules would protect him. Tomorrow, either the jury would watch how little any of that mattered when someone decided their convenience was worth more than his life. The courtroom lights dimmed slightly as the prosecution prepared to play the traffic camera footage, the change in brightness creating an atmosphere that felt more like a theater than a place of law, though the performance about to unfold was one no one wanted to see. Jurors leaned forward in their seats, some unconsciously, drawn by the gravity of what they were about to witness. The large screen at the front of the room flickered to life, displaying the intersection of Maple and 7th in grainy black and white, the timestamp in the corner reading 1:41 and 30 seconds in the morning. The view was from above, the camera mounted on a pole, providing a bird's-eye perspective that reduced human beings to moving shapes but captured motion and sequence with undeniable clarity. The intersection sat empty for several seconds, traffic lights cycling through their programmed patterns, the city asleep except for the occasional passing car. Then, from the right side of the frame, a figure appeared, small on the screen but unmistakably human in movement, approaching the crosswalk and stopping at the curb. Mateo Torres, reduced to pixels, but still recognizably a person following the rules, waiting patiently for his turn to cross. The pedestrian signal changed to white, and he stepped into the road with the confident stride of someone trusting a system designed to protect him. Seconds later, from the opposite direction, headlights appeared, bright enough to bloom slightly on the low-resolution camera, moving faster than the other vehicles that had passed through earlier in the footage. The white SUV entered the frame with visible speed, approaching the red light that should have commanded it to stop. There was no slowing, no indication of brakes being applied, just steady acceleration toward an intersection where a human being was already halfway across the designated safe zone. The collision happened in a fraction of a second, too fast for the eye to fully process, even though everyone in the courtroom knew it was coming. The shape that was Mateo disappeared from view in a blur of motion, the SUV continuing through the intersection without pause, its brake lights never illuminating, tail lights growing smaller as it sped away into darkness. The footage continued for another 30 seconds, showing the empty intersection again, but this time with a dark shape lying motionless near the far curb, textbooks and debris scattered across the asphalt like evidence of violence the camera couldn't quite resolve into detail. A collective gasp rippled through the gallery, several people covering their mouths, one juror visibly flinching at the moment of impact. Haley sat perfectly still at the defense table, her face drained of color, jaw clenched so tightly a muscle jumped in her cheek. The prosecution followed the raw footage with the digital reconstruction, a computer-generated animation that translated physics and measurements into a clean, sterile simulation that somehow made the violence more comprehensible and therefore more devastating. The animation opened with a three-dimensional model of the intersection, rendered in bright colors against a neutral gray background. Traffic lights glowing red and green in their proper positions, the crosswalk marked in crisp white lines. A blue figure representing Mateo appeared at the curb, pausing as programmed, waiting for the signal. When the pedestrian light changed, the figure began crossing at a steady walking pace, calculated from average human movement. Simultaneously, a red vehicle representing the Lexus approached from the opposite direction, speed indicated by a digital readout in the corner, 47 miles per hour in a 30-mile-per-hour zone. The expert witness who had created the reconstruction narrated in a calm, clinical voice, explaining that the animation was based on skid marks, or rather, their absence, vehicle damage patterns, witness statements, and the traffic camera footage they had just viewed. He pointed out with laser precision that a driver traveling at the legal speed limit, paying attention to the road, would have had clear sight lines to see the pedestrian entering the crosswalk from more than 100 feet away, providing ample time and distance to brake completely and avoid collision. The animation was played at normal speed first, showing the inevitable collision in real time, then slowed to half speed so the jury could absorb every element. The pedestrian in the crosswalk, where he had every legal right to be. The vehicle approaching the red light with no reduction in velocity. The moment of impact when the blue figure was struck and thrown. of the vehicle continuing without braking through the intersection and beyond. The slowed version made clear what the grainy traffic footage had only suggested. This wasn't about a pedestrian appearing suddenly from nowhere, or visibility problems, or split-second reaction times. There had been time, distance, and clear lines of sight. What had been missing was attention, sobriety, and the most basic respect for the laws designed to prevent exactly this kind of tragedy. The prosecutor let the animation end and remain frozen on the final frame, the blue figure motionless on the pavement, the red vehicle disappearing off-screen, allowing the image to settle into the jury's consciousness. Several jurors stared at the screen with expressions ranging from sadness to anger, one woman shaking her head slowly, like another man leaning back and crossing his arms as if physically distancing himself from what he'd just witnessed. The narration underscored what everyone in the room now understood. Physics doesn't care about excuses, and mathematics doesn't negotiate. The prosecution then introduced the final Snapchat video recorded inside the vehicle at 1:41 in the morning, just 60 seconds before the estimated time of impact. The clip was played on the courtroom screens, audio crackling slightly through the speaker system. The interior of the SUV filled the frame, dashboard lights casting a glow across young faces, music pounding from speakers loud enough to distort the phone's microphone, voices singing along off-key. Haley's face appeared briefly as she turned to record her friends in the back seat, her eyes clearly not on the road, or her expression carefree and laughing. In the background, visible through the windshield in the upper portion of the frame, a traffic light glowed red, faint but unmistakable once the prosecution pointed it out. A friend's voice, giggling and loose, said clearly, "We're going to run it, aren't we?" followed by more laughter that suggested this was entertainment rather than concern. The video cut off abruptly 15 seconds in, the screen going black. The prosecutor explained to the jury that phone metadata showed the device registered a violent jolt moments after the recording stopped, consistent with high-speed impact, followed immediately by sustained acceleration. The damning implication hung in the air. She had been recording herself and her friends instead of watching the road, made approaching a red light that her passengers had noticed even if she hadn't, and when the collision occurred, her instinct wasn't to stop but to flee. A digital forensics expert took the stand to walk the jury through the phone data with the methodical precision of someone who understood that every detail mattered. He explained metadata in language stripped of technical jargon, timestamps that showed exactly when each message was sent, GPS coordinates that tracked the phone's movement through the city, motion sensors that recorded velocity and sudden changes in direction. He displayed text logs on the courtroom screens, messages sent from Haley's phone in the 20 minutes following the collision, sent not to emergency services but to friends not present in the vehicle. One message, and sent at 1:58 in the morning from her home address, read, "OMG, we hit something and it was so loud I thought we'd die, LOL." Another, sent 3 minutes later. "Pretty sure we're okay though, nothing happened." There was no follow-up indicating concern about what or who they had hit, no attempt to call for help, no suggestion that she had considered returning to the scene. The expert confirmed that the phone never left the general vicinity of the Knox residence after arriving there around 2 in the morning, contradicting any potential claim that she had tried to go back and check. These cold data points painted a picture more damaging than any witness testimony could have achieved. Someone more shaken by her own fear than moved by concern for whoever her vehicle had just struck. One of Haley's passengers, subpoenaed by the prosecution despite clear reluctance to testify against her former friend, took the stand, looking visibly nervous, her hands twisting together in her lap. She was 17, pale and thin, eyes red-rimmed as if she'd been crying before entering the courtroom. Under oath, fighting back tears, she described the moments after impact in halting sentences that carried the weight of trauma and guilt. She testified that she had begged Haley to turn around immediately after they felt the collision, screaming at her to stop the car. She described Haley's response in words that would become one of the most quoted lines of the trial. "Do you want me to go to jail for some idiot who walked into the road?" The courtroom murmured at the statement, several people gasping audibly, and Judge Cole had to bang her gavel for order. The witness continued, explaining that she had looked back through the rear window and seen a shape lying in the street, that she knew in her gut it wasn't an animal, but a person, and that Haley had refused to stop despite being told this. She described arriving at the Knox house, where Haley had immediately started talking about how to explain the damage to the car, about whether they should take it to a body shop that night or wait, about making sure their stories aligned if anyone asked questions. At no point, the witness testified, did Haley express concern about whoever they had hit or suggest calling for help. The defense's cross-examination of the passenger witness attempted to poke holes in her account, suggesting that trauma and subsequent media coverage had distorted her memories, and that the stress of the moment had made details blur and shift. Ellison pressed her on minor inconsistencies between her initial police statement and her trial testimony, moments where she had said she wasn't sure or couldn't remember exactly what words were used. But despite his efforts, her core account remained consistent and credible. Haley had been told immediately that they'd hit something serious, possibly a person, and had chosen to continue home rather than stop. The jurors appeared skeptical of the defense's attempts to discredit her, their body language suggesting they found her visible distress and obvious reluctance to testify more convincing than the lawyer's suggestions that she was confused or unreliable. The prosecutor's redirect was brief, asking simply, despite any uncertainty about exact wording, "Are you certain that Haley was told you might have hit a person and chose not to go back?" The witness nodded, tears finally spilling over, and whispered, "Yes, I told her," and she kept driving. The chapter closed with the prosecution introducing a statement from a detention officer who had been assigned to the juvenile wing during Haley's initial custody before she posted bond. He testified that he had overheard Haley speaking to another inmate in the common area, not realizing or not caring that officers could hear. According to his contemporaneous notes, which he referred to while testifying, she had said, "It's not like I meant to kill anyone. They're acting like I'm some psycho. I'll be out before I'm 25, probably way before. My dad's lawyer is really good." The defense objected immediately, arguing that the statement was prejudicial and taken out of context, that private conversations shouldn't be used against defendants. Judge Cole overruled the objection, noting that statements made in detention facilities where monitoring was clearly posted were not privileged, and that the jury could weigh the evidence's value for themselves. The words hung in the courtroom like an indictment more powerful than the formal charges. Not remorse for Mateo's death, but calculation about her own future, confidence that this too would be something she could navigate and overcome. The chapter ended with jurors staring at Haley, their faces reflecting something that looked like understanding, finally crystallizing into judgment. The evidence no longer abstract but accumulated into a picture too clear to misinterpret. And the final shot contrasted two spaces where different audiences processed the same information. Outside the courtroom in the hallway, television screens mounted on the walls replayed the Snapchat clip on a loop for reporters and spectators who couldn't get seats inside, the footage accompanied by sensational headlines and commentary. In a dimly lit church sanctuary across town, Mateo's friends and classmates had gathered for a prayer vigil, timed to coincide with the trial, his photograph surrounded by candles that flickered in the quiet, their light small but persistent. The echo line brought the two images together. In one room, they watched her laugh seconds before a life ended, her face illuminated by the glow of a phone that mattered more to her than the road ahead. In another room, they watched his face flicker in candlelight, wishing desperately that they could rewind that night and make her look up, slow down, see him as a person instead of an inconvenience in her path. A forensic toxicologist took the stand on the trial's 8th day, a woman with 20 years of experience testifying in cases where impairment played a central role in tragedy. She explained to the jury in clear, accessible language how alcohol affects the brain and body, particularly in teenagers whose neurological development made them more vulnerable to impairment at lower doses than adults. Charts displayed on the courtroom screens showed the cascade of effects: slowed reaction time, reduced depth perception, impaired judgment, decreased ability to process multiple stimuli simultaneously. She walked through the science of blood alcohol concentration, explaining how the body metabolizes alcohol at predictable rates and how experts could calculate backward from a blood draw taken hours after an incident to estimate intoxication levels at a specific earlier time. Based on Haley's blood draw taken at 4:30 in the morning and accounting for conservative metabolism rates, the expert testified that her blood alcohol content at 1:42 would have been approximately 0.13, significantly above the legal limit for adults and astronomically beyond any acceptable level for a minor. The prosecutor asked a simple question that landed with devastating clarity. In your professional opinion, should a reasonable person in the defendant's condition have known it was unsafe to operate a vehicle? The expert answered without hesitation. Absolutely. At that level of intoxication, driving is not just unsafe, it's reckless. The defense presented their own expert during their portion of the case, a toxicologist with impressive credentials who had testified in dozens of trials, usually for defendants challenging prosecution science. He critiqued the methodology used to extrapolate backward from the blood draw, arguing that metabolism rates varied widely between individuals and that factors like food consumption, body weight, and genetic differences made precise calculations impossible. He suggested that the prosecution's estimate could be off by as much as 0.03 in either direction, creating what he called reasonable doubt about the exact level of impairment at the moment of collision. He also raised questions about whether the presence of THC, which could remain detectable in blood for days after use, indicated actual impairment that night or simply past consumption. Under cross-examination, however, the prosecution dismantled his testimony with surgical precision. Even accepting his most generous estimates, Reyes pointed out, Haley's blood alcohol content would still have been well above the legal limit. The expert was forced to concede that even at the lowest plausible calculation, she had been significantly impaired. When asked directly whether a sober, attentive driver could have avoided the collision, he admitted, after a long pause, "Likely, yes." The prosecution had turned the defense's own witness into another piece of evidence supporting the narrative of preventable tragedy. The defense also called character witnesses in an attempt to humanize Haley and present her as more than the sum of her worst decisions. Former teachers testified about her intelligence and potential, describing her as a bright student capable of excellent work when motivated. A volunteer coordinator from an animal shelter spoke about Haley's participation in fundraising events, her willingness to help with difficult tasks, her apparent affection for the rescue dogs. One teacher became emotional, her voice breaking as she said, "I never imagined I'd see her here like this. She had so much potential." The testimonies were clearly designed to evoke sympathy, to remind the jury that Haley was a full person with positive qualities, not a cartoon villain. But for many observers in the gallery, including members of the Torres family, the parade of character witnesses felt like another example of the system bending to protect privilege, or offering a depth of consideration that rarely extended to defendants without resources. The unspoken question hung in the air. Would a poor teenager, a black or brown teenager, receive this same careful cataloging of their good qualities, or would they be defined entirely by their worst moment? The prosecution's counter to the character evidence came in the form of testimonies about Mateo. a deliberate strategy to remind the jury that this wasn't an abstract legal exercise, but the story of a real person whose absence left a crater in the lives of everyone who knew him. His high school track coach took the stand and described a young man with extraordinary work ethic who stayed after practice to help younger teammates, who never complained even when training was grueling. A teacher who'd had Mateo in multiple classes spoke about his quiet kindness, the way he would stay late to help clean up after school events without being asked, the respectful way he addressed everyone regardless of their position. A classmate, struggling to maintain composure, shared how Mateo had tutored him in calculus for free every week, patiently explaining concepts until they made sense, never making him feel stupid for needing help. These details accumulated into a portrait of someone who had moved through the world trying to make it slightly better, whose default mode was consideration rather than entitlement. Photographs of Mateo at various ages were displayed. A gap-toothed child holding a soccer trophy, a teenager in a tuxedo at prom, a college freshman moving boxes into a dorm room with his whole future stretching ahead. Several jurors wiped away tears openly, and even some reporters in the back row were seen dabbing at their eyes. Against her attorney's initial strong advice, Haley insisted on testifying in her own defense, convinced that if the jury just heard her side directly, they would understand that she wasn't the monster the prosecution had painted. Her parents supported the decision, their faith in their daughter's ability to explain herself outweighing the lawyer's warnings about the risks of cross-examination. Mark Ellison spent hours preparing her, coaching her on tone and phrasing, running through potential questions until her answers sounded natural rather than rehearsed. On the morning she was scheduled to take the stand, she dressed even more carefully than usual. A simple dress in muted colors, minimal makeup, her hair pulled back in a style that suggested youth and vulnerability. As she walked to the witness stand and was sworn in, her hand trembling slightly as it rested on the Bible, the courtroom fell into an anticipatory silence. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for, the chance to hear directly from the person at the center of the tragedy, to see if remorse could be genuine or if the mask would slip again. Under direct examination by her attorney, Haley appeared composed, speaking clearly, her voice occasionally cracking with emotion that seemed at least partially genuine. She described the night as the worst of my life, a phrase that rang hollow to anyone who understood that Mateo's night had been definitively worse since it ended with his death. She claimed she had only had a few drinks and hadn't felt impaired, that she'd driven that route dozens of times and felt confident. She insisted she didn't realize she had hit a person, only that she'd heard a bump and felt scared, her teenage brain unable to process what had happened in the chaos and confusion. She said she'd been in shock when she got home, that she hadn't thought clearly, that by the time she realized the severity of what happened, the police were already at her door. She turned slightly toward where the Torres family sat and offered what appeared to be a prepared apology. I wish I could go back and change everything. I wish I could trade places with him. I'm so sorry for your loss. The words had the hollow quality of something practiced in a mirror, technically correct but emotionally unconvincing. A few jurors appeared sympathetic, or at least conflicted, and their expressions suggesting they wanted to believe in the possibility of genuine remorse, even if the delivery left them uncertain. Then the prosecutor rose for cross-examination, and the temperature in the courtroom shifted palpably. Victoria Reyes approached the witness stand with the calm confidence of someone who had been waiting for this moment, who had prepared for it with the understanding that this testimony could make or break the case. She began gently, almost conversationally, asking about Haley's evening before the crash, where she went, who she was with, what she consumed. Haley's answers were careful, measured, clearly trying to minimize without outright lying, since she knew contradictory evidence existed. Then Reyes shifted to the contradictions, pulling them out one by one like threads that unraveled the carefully constructed narrative. She confronted Haley with her own text messages from that evening, messages bragging about how much she'd had to drink, jokes about being too gone to function. She asked about the Snapchat video recorded seconds before impact, forcing Haley to watch it again on the screen in front of her, her own laughing face a witness against her claims of careful, sober driving. When asked why she hadn't called 911 after the collision, Haley repeated, "I panicked. I was scared. I didn't know what to do." Reyes pressed, "You were scared enough to drive home carefully without getting pulled over. Scared enough to park the car in your driveway. Scared enough to go inside and text your friends. But not scared enough to call for help for the person you'd just hit?" The prosecutor moved through the evidence methodically, each question designed to narrow the space where Haley could hide behind claims of confusion or panic. She brought up the witness testimony from the passenger who said Haley had been told immediately that they might have hit a person. "If you were in shock and didn't understand what happened, why did you tell your friend that you weren't going to jail for some idiot who walked into the road?" Haley's face flushed, her composure beginning to crack. "I don't remember saying that. She's confused." Reyes continued, asking about the detention center comment, the statement about being out before she was 25. "Does that sound like someone consumed with remorse? Or someone calculating how to minimize consequences?" Frustration seeped into Haley's voice as her answers became more defensive, less controlled. "I was a kid, okay? Everyone's acting like I'm some kind of monster. I made a mistake, one mistake, and now my whole life is ruined." The prosecutor seized the moment with a question that hung in the air like an indictment. "Miss Knox, when exactly did your concern for Mateo Torres outweigh your concern for yourself?" The silence that followed was damning. Haley had no clear answer, her mouth opening and closing as she searched for words that wouldn't incriminate her further, but also couldn't honestly claim she'd prioritized the victim over herself at any point. At one point during the cross-examination, when Reyes highlighted the Snapchat post where Haley had called herself untouchable, several people in the gallery reacted with audible gasps and murmurs. Haley's face tightened, and for just a moment that familiar expression returned. The slight roll of her eyes, the ghost of a smirk suggesting the whole thing was being blown out of proportion. The jurors saw it. Judge Cole saw it. The Torres family definitely saw it. Lena's hand gripping Raphael's arm so tightly, he winced. The prosecutor paused deliberately, letting the expression hang in the silence, giving the jury time to register what they were seeing. Not contrition, not growth, but the same arrogance that had brought Haley to this courtroom in the first place. Reyes let the moment breathe, then said quietly, "No further questions, Your Honor." She returned to her seat, leaving Haley on the witness stand, looking smaller and more exposed than she had when she'd confidently taken the oath. The redirect examination by her attorney tried to rehabilitate her testimony, but the damage was done, the mask having slipped just enough to confirm what many had suspected all along. The chapter ended on that image. Haley still sitting in the witness box, her face half-shadowed by the angle of the courtroom lights, the state seal hanging on the wall behind her like a judgment already rendered. The camera cut to a contrasting image pulled from the Torres family's home videos, played earlier in the trial. Mateo's genuine, unguarded smile as he laughed at something off-camera. Sunlight catching his face, his expression open and full of the kind of joy that couldn't be manufactured or performed. Two smiles captured for posterity, one calculated and deployed as a tool of manipulation, one authentic and now preserved only in memory and digital files. The echo line brought them together with devastating clarity. She thought her words could charm her way out, that the right performance could rewrite the story her actions had already told. But his smile was the one the jury couldn't forget, the one that reminded them that behind every legal term and piece of evidence was a person who would never smile again, never laugh again, never get the chance to become who he was supposed to be. And that made all the difference. In the closing argument, the prosecutor rose with the measured gravity of someone who understood this was the final opportunity to weave months of evidence into a narrative that demanded accountability. Victoria Reyes stood before the jury without notes, having internalized every detail, every photograph, every witness statement until the case lived inside her as completely as it lived in the evidence boxes stacked in her office. She began not with legal elements, but with a simple reconstruction of two parallel timelines that converged at 1:42 in the morning. On one path, Mateo Torres finishing his shift at the bookstore, texting his mother that he loved her, walking home through well-lit streets, stopping at a crosswalk and waiting for the signal because that's what responsible people did. On the other path, Haley Knox drinking at a party, getting behind the wheel despite knowing she was impaired, speeding through residential streets while recording videos on her phone, or was approaching a red light that her own passengers noticed even if she didn't. This was not destiny, Reyes said, her voice carrying to every corner of the courtroom. This was not fate. This was a chain of selfish decisions, each one compounding the last, each one prioritizing her entertainment and convenience over the safety of everyone else on the road. She walked the jury through the legal elements of vehicular homicide with clinical precision, matching each requirement with testimony they had heard and evidence they had seen. Did the defendant operate a vehicle while under the influence? The toxicology reports and her own admissions confirmed it beyond any doubt. Did that impaired operation directly cause the death of another person? The traffic camera, the reconstruction, the medical examiner's testimony all pointed to the same inescapable conclusion. Did the defendant act with criminal negligence, creating a substantial and unjustifiable risk? She had been drinking, speeding, filming videos instead of watching the road, running a red light in a manner that made collision not just possible, but probable. Each element was satisfied, not marginally, but overwhelmingly. The evidence stacked so high that reasonable doubt had no room to exist. Reyes reminded them of the passenger's testimony about what Haley said after the impact, the choice to flee rather than render aid, the attempts to cover up and minimize afterward. These weren't the actions of someone confused or in shock, she said. These were the calculated decisions of someone who knew exactly what she'd done and cared more about avoiding consequences than about the life she'd just taken. The prosecutor's voice softened slightly as she shifted from legal arguments to moral ones, understanding that verdicts were decided as much by conscience as by law. She spoke about Mateo's mother sitting in the courtroom every day, clutching that photograph, forcing herself to hear every detail of her son's final moments because bearing witness was the only thing she could still do for him. She talked about the empty chair at the Torres family table, the bedroom that remained untouched because cleaning it would feel like erasing him, the younger siblings who were now afraid to cross streets even with their parents holding their hands. Should the defense wants you to focus on Haley's potential, on the future she might have if you show mercy, Reyes said, her eyes moving across the jurors' faces. But I ask you to remember that Mateo had potential too. He had dreams of building bridges and roads that would keep people safe. He had a family who loved him and a community that needed him. And all of that was stolen in the seconds it took for her to decide that a red light didn't apply to her. Her final appeal was simple and devastating in its directness. Give Mateo Torres the dignity of a verdict that says his life mattered, not as much as her convenience, not less than her fear of consequences, but absolutely, fundamentally, undeniably. His life mattered, and the person who took it must be held accountable, not because we want revenge, but because justice demands that we acknowledge what was lost and why. She returned to her seat in silence, letting the words settle over the jury like a weight they would carry into deliberations. Several jurors were visibly emotional, one woman dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, a man in the back row staring at the table in front of him as if the wood grain held answers to questions he wasn't sure how to ask. Mark Ellison's closing argument for the defense took a markedly different approach, his tone softer and more introspective, an appeal to compassion rather than outrage. He began by acknowledging the tragedy fully and without reservation, a strategic choice meant to demonstrate that disagreement about legal culpability didn't mean dismissing the profound loss the Torres family had suffered. No one in this courtroom, least of all Haley Knox, disputes that Mateo Torres's death was a devastating tragedy that never should have happened, he said, his voice carrying genuine solemnity. The question before you isn't whether something terrible occurred. It's whether the law, in its complexity and its wisdom, defines that terrible thing as murder committed by a monster, or as a tragic accident made by a frightened teenager whose brain wasn't fully developed enough to process the choices she was making in real time. He reminded the jury that the law distinguished between different levels of culpability, that intent mattered, that the difference between murder and tragic mistake was not semantic, but fundamental to how justice worked in a civilized society. He challenged the prosecution's characterization of Haley as calculating and remorseless, pointing to what he called the natural human response of panic and self-preservation that could explain her flight from the scene. When confronted with the most terrifying moment of her life, she didn't respond perfectly. She didn't respond the way we wish she had. But panic isn't the same as malice, and making a terrible decision in a moment of fear doesn't make someone a monster. He argued that the prosecution had cherry-picked moments and statements to build a narrative of arrogance while ignoring the hours of testimony about her positive qualities, her youth, her lack of criminal history. He spoke about brain development science that showed teenage prefrontal cortexes weren't fully formed, making impulse control and consequence assessment biologically more difficult. She made terrible choices, he conceded. No choices she will live with for the rest of her life, regardless of your verdict. But under our legal system, we punish people proportionally to their culpability, and we recognize that youth and impaired judgment matter when assessing what someone deserves. His final argument focused on what he framed as a question of purpose versus punishment. Sending Haley to prison for decades won't bring Mateo back, he said, his voice heavy with the sadness of that truth. It won't ease his family's pain. It won't undo the tragedy. What it will do is destroy another young life, take another person's potential, and crush it in the machinery of a system designed for adults who commit premeditated violence. I ask yourselves whether that serves justice or simply satisfies a desire for revenge. He urged the jury to consider a verdict on lesser charges that would hold Haley accountable without, as he put it, throwing away a 17-year-old's entire existence. He reminded them that they had the power to show mercy, to recognize the difference between someone who chose to kill and someone who made catastrophically bad decisions that resulted in death. She is not a monster, he concluded, his eyes sweeping across the jury box. She is a child who made the worst mistake imaginable, and our legal system is supposed to be wise enough to know the difference. Victoria Reyes rose for rebuttal, her final opportunity to address the jury, and she used it to dismantle the defense's appeal to mercy with surgical precision. She reminded them of Haley's own words and actions, the detention center comment about being out before 25, the smirk in court that multiple jurors had witnessed, the comment to reporters about vultures when asked if she had anything to say to the victim's family. The defense wants you to believe that Haley didn't understand consequences because of her age and brain development, Reyes said, her voice calm but edged with steel. But she understood consequences well enough to try to hide what she'd done. She understood them well enough to lie to police. She understood them well enough to calculate how long she might serve. The only thing she didn't understand, the only thing she still doesn't understand, is that other people's lives matter as much as hers. She spoke about remorse, contrasting the image the defense had tried to paint with the reality the jury had witnessed. "Remorse isn't something you put on for trial like a carefully chosen outfit," she said, gesturing toward Haley at the defense table. "Remorse is the weight you carry every day. It's the thing that keeps you awake at night, that makes you physically ill when you think about what you've done, that drives you to do everything possible to make amends, even though you know nothing can truly make it right. Ask yourselves who in this courtroom you've seen carrying that weight. Was it Haley Knox, smirking at reporters and complaining that her life is ruined? Or was it Lena Torres, clutching a photograph of her son and forcing herself to sit through every moment of this trial because it's the last thing she can do for him?" The contrast was devastating in its simplicity, impossible to ignore or explain away. Several jurors nodded slightly, their body language suggesting the prosecutor's words were confirming conclusions they'd already reached. Her final lines were delivered with quiet intensity, each word measured for maximum impact. "The defense asked you to consider whether destroying Haley's future serves justice. I ask you to remember that she destroyed Mateo's future first, and she did it while laughing with her friends, filming videos, and treating traffic laws like suggestions that didn't apply to her. Justice isn't about revenge. It's about acknowledging that actions have consequences, that lives have value, and that no one, no matter how young, how privileged, or how well-connected, gets to take another person's life and walk away because accountability would be inconvenient." She paused, letting the silence build, then delivered her final line. "Mateo Torres followed every rule and died anyway. Hold her accountable for the one rule that mattered most, the one that says you don't get to kill someone and call it a mistake." She returned to her seat as the jury sat in heavy silence, the weight of their responsibility visible in every face. Judge Cole delivered detailed jury instructions explaining the burden of proof, the definitions of each charge, and the legal standards they must apply in their deliberations. She emphasized that their verdict must be based solely on evidence presented in court, not sympathy or emotion, though everyone in the room understood that separating evidence from emotion in a case like this was nearly impossible. Her voice was steady, carrying the authority of decades on the bench, but her eyes revealed that she understood the weight of what she was asking these 12 people to do. Once the instructions were complete, she sent the jury to deliberate, the gavel tapping once, with a sound that felt like a door closing on one phase and opening to another. The jurors filed out slowly, their expressions serious, several of them glancing back at Haley and then at the Torres family, as if trying to hold both realities in their minds at once. The chapter ended with a split image capturing the two families in the moments after the jury left to deliberate. On one side, the Knox family in a small conference room reserved for the defense, huddled together, Elaine's hand on Haley's shoulder, Robert on his phone, already calling someone. Another lawyer, perhaps, or preparing for appeals. On the other side, the Torres family in the courthouse hallway, sitting on hard wooden benches, Lena's head resting on Raphael's shoulder, both of them staring at nothing, exhausted by weeks of testimony but unable to leave, tethered to this building by the hope that justice might finally arrive. The echo line brought their parallel waiting into focus. One family prepared for the possibility of loss they'd never imagined having to consider. The other had been living in that loss every day for months, and now they waited to find out if the system would acknowledge that their son's life had been worth something more than a tragic footnote in someone else's story of poor choices and second chances. Hours turned into a full day as the jury reviewed evidence in a secluded room where the weight of 12 individual consciences had to somehow merge into a single collective decision. They replayed videos, reread transcripts, sketched timelines on a whiteboard someone had wheeled in to help organize the mountain of information they were required to process. Heated discussions broke out over intent versus consequence, youth versus accountability. The question of whether a 17-year-old should face the same penalties as an adult when the harm caused was identical, regardless of the age of the person who caused it. One juror reportedly said, her voice rising with emotion, "If we don't hold her accountable, what message are we sending to every other kid who thinks rules don't apply to them?" Another worried aloud about a life ruined at 17, but was countered immediately with, "One life was ended at 18. Doesn't that matter more?" The room slowly moved toward consensus. The weight of evidence and testimony, and the image of Lena Torres clutching that photograph, gradually overcoming any lingering doubts or desires to show mercy that wasn't earned. In the hallway outside the courtroom, the Torres family maintained their vigil on uncomfortable wooden benches that had become as familiar as furniture in their own home. Lena sat with Mateo's rosary wrapped around her fingers, the beads worn smooth from months of prayers whispered in English and Spanish. But a continuous conversation with a son she could no longer reach any other way. Raphael stared at the courtroom doors with an intensity that suggested he was trying to see through them, to witness the deliberations, to ensure through sheer force of will that justice would arrive. Family members brought food that went mostly uneaten, coffee that grew cold in paper cups, clutched but forgotten. They knew intellectually that no verdict could bring Mateo back, that the best possible outcome still meant living the rest of their lives with an absence that nothing could fill. But they hoped for something that felt like recognition of his value, an acknowledgement from the legal system that his life had mattered, that taking it carried consequences that couldn't be negotiated away with money and lawyers. Across the hall, separated by a distance that felt both physical and symbolic, Haley sat in a small conference room with her parents and legal team, her earlier confidence visibly eroded by days of testimony that had painted her in colors she didn't recognize and couldn't effectively refute. She picked at her cuticles until they bled, a nervous habit that betrayed the anxiety her face tried to hide. Her parents attempted reassurance, repeating phrases her attorney had used about reasonable doubt and the high burden of proof, but their words sounded hollow even to themselves. Mark Ellison reviewed potential appeal grounds, preparing for an outcome he'd tried to prevent, but had to be ready to address. The waiting felt different for them than it did for the Torres family. Not grief, but dread, not loss already experienced, but loss anticipated. The possibility that their daughter might disappear into the criminal justice system for years or decades, reduced from a person to an inmate number, from a future full of possibilities to a past full of regrets. Late in the afternoon of the second day of deliberations, the bailiff received word that the jury had reached a verdict. The announcement rippled through the courthouse like an electric current, reporters scrambling to reclaim seats, community members who had been waiting in the cafeteria rushing back to the courtroom, both families summoned from their separate spaces of waiting. Haley's hands visibly trembled as she took her seat at the defense table, her attorney placing a steadying hand on her shoulder and whispering something that might have been encouragement or might have been final preparation for the worst. The Torres family filed into their familiar front row, holding hands in a chain of connection that had sustained them through every hearing, every motion, every day of trial. Judge Cole entered and took the bench, her expression solemn, and instructed the bailiff to bring in the jury. The 12 people who had spent days deliberating filed in slowly, none of them making eye contact with the defense table, a detail that experienced court observers recognized as a signal of conviction. The courtroom held its breath as Judge Cole asked if the jury had reached a verdict. The foreperson, a middle-aged man who had been a high school teacher before retiring, stood and confirmed they had. The clerk took the verdict forms and passed them to the judge, who reviewed them silently, her face revealing nothing, and before handing them back to be read aloud. In the matter of the state versus Haley Marie Knox, the clerk began, her voice steady despite the tension crackling through the air. On the charge of vehicular homicide, we the jury find the defendant guilty. A collective gasp rippled through the gallery, followed by the sound of Lena's sob breaking through the silence she'd tried to maintain. The clerk continued through the remaining charges, each one ending with the same word that landed like a hammer-striking stone. Guilty of leaving the scene of a fatal collision. Guilty of driving under the influence. 3 counts, 3 guilty verdicts, the cumulative weight of them transforming Haley from defendant to convicted felon in the span of seconds. Haley's reaction was visible to everyone in the courtroom, captured by cameras that would replay the moment endlessly on news broadcasts and true crime documentaries. Her carefully maintained composure shattered completely, the mask she'd worn throughout trial falling away to reveal genuine shock underneath. Her mouth formed the word no, though no sound emerged, her head shaking slowly in disbelief as if physical denial could somehow change the words the clerk had just spoken. She had believed, despite everything, that this wouldn't happen to her, that some combination of her age, her father's influence, and her attorney's skill would create enough doubt to spare her from conviction. That belief crumbled as the clerk polled each juror individually, asking them to confirm their verdict. And 12 voices in succession said, "Guilty," each repetition another nail in the coffin of her delusion of untouchability. Her legs began to tremble visibly, and she grabbed the edge of the table to steady herself, her attorney's hand on her shoulder the only thing keeping her from collapsing entirely. Judge Cole thanked the jury for their service with genuine gratitude, acknowledging the difficulty of what they'd been asked to do and the seriousness with which they'd approach their responsibility. She dismissed them with instructions about media contact and offered counseling services if the emotional weight of the case proved too heavy to carry alone. Once the jury had filed out, she turned her attention back to the matter at hand, ordering a pre-sentencing investigation to be completed within 30 days and setting a date for the sentencing hearing. "Between now and then," she said, her eyes moving to Haley, who was struggling to maintain any semblance of composure, "this court will consider all relevant factors, your age, your history, your conduct before and after the crime, and most importantly, the impact of your actions on the Torres family and this community. You will remain in custody pending sentencing." The words stripped away the last remnant of Haley's previous life, the ankle monitor and house arrest replaced now with immediate detention, the transition from defendant out on bond to convicted criminal happening in the space between one sentence and the next. Outside the courtroom after the verdict, microphones swarmed both families, capturing reactions that would dominate local news for days. The Torres family offered a brief statement that Lena read from a trembling piece of paper, her voice breaking but determined. She expressed gratitude to the jury for seeing the truth, to the prosecutor for fighting for Mateo, and to the community for supporting them through the darkest period of their lives. She mentioned that she still prayed for Haley to truly understand what she'd done, to find genuine remorse rather than self-pity. "There is no justice that brings my son back," she said, tears streaming down her face. "But today, the court told the world his life mattered. That means something. It has to mean something." Raphael stood beside her, his arm around her shoulders. His own eyes wet, but his jaw set in the same determined expression he'd worn since the first day of trial. The Knox family, in contrast, pushed through the crowd in tight silence, their previous confidence replaced with stunned devastation, Robert's arm protectively around Elaine, as reporters shouted questions they refused to answer. The chapter ended with Haley in a holding cell, the immediate aftermath of conviction replacing the trappings of her former life with cinder-block walls and a narrow bench. She had traded her carefully chosen courtroom outfit for a jail-issue jumpsuit again, her phone for an inmate number, her curated social media identity for a legal designation. Convicted felon. She sat with her back against the cold wall, knees pulled to her chest, staring at nothing as the reality of what had just happened began to penetrate the shock. Without cameras or family or attorneys present, her face finally showed something that might have been the beginning of genuine understanding, or might have just been fear of what came next. Years from now, she would replay this moment in her mind, the memory of hearing guilty 12 times in a row, each repetition another door closing on the future she'd imagined. At the intersection of Maple and 7th, the small memorial remained. Flowers refreshed weekly by strangers, candles lit by community members who'd never met Mateo but felt connected to his story. A faded photograph taped to the traffic signal pole, showing a young man smiling into a future he'd never reach. Every time the light turned red now, cars slowed with a little more attention, our drivers a little more aware, the story having seeped into community consciousness in a way that made the intersection itself a memorial. The visual echo brought the chapter to a close with two contrasting images that captured the fundamental shift that had occurred. On one side, Judge Cole's desk in her chambers, now holding a thick pre-sentencing file with Haley's name on it, psychological evaluations, and victim impact statements waiting to be read and weighted against each other in the mathematics of punishment. On the other side, Mateo's bedroom, unchanged since the night he left for work and never came home, his textbook still open to pages he'd been studying, a calendar on the wall with future dates that would never arrive, plans that existed now only as ghosts of what might have been. The echo line delivered the weight of the verdict's meaning. One teenager's future would now be measured in years of confinement, consequences finally arriving after a lifetime of avoiding them. The other's future had been measured in the seconds it took for headlights to reach a crosswalk, and no verdict could ever balance that equation or restore what had been stolen. But at least finally, the scales of justice had acknowledged that both lives mattered. One ended, one forever changed, both irrevocably marked by choices made in the darkness before dawn. The courtroom was more crowded than ever for sentencing day, packed beyond capacity with community members who had followed every development, reporters who understood this was the moment that would define the case in public memory, and observers from advocacy groups on both sides of the debate about how society should punish teenage offenders. The case had become something larger than just one collision, transformed into a referendum on privilege, accountability, and whether the criminal justice system could actually deliver equal consequences regardless of wealth or family connections. Haley entered in her orange jumpsuit, no longer afforded the opportunity to dress in carefully chosen civilian clothes meant to evoke sympathy. She looked smaller somehow, diminished by weeks in custody, her face bare of makeup and her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail that suggested institutional efficiency rather than personal choice. The Torres family sat in their familiar front row, a mixture of exhaustion and resolve visible in their faces, unholding each other's hands in the formation that had become their ritual of mutual support. The air felt heavy with anticipation, like everyone was waiting for a storm to finally break after weeks of oppressive buildup. Judge Meredith Cole took the bench with the gravity of someone fully aware that the words she spoke in the next hour would echo far beyond this courtroom, would be quoted in news articles and legal textbooks, would potentially influence how other judges approached similar cases for years to come. She began by acknowledging the difficulty of the proceeding, the competing interests that had to be weighed: public safety, punishment, deterrence, rehabilitation, the rights of the convicted, and the irreplaceable loss suffered by the victim's family. She noted that she had read every page of the pre-sentencing investigation, on every letter submitted by both sides, every psychological evaluation and victim impact statement. The room fell into absolute silence, broken only by the soft sound of someone crying quietly in the back row. Haley stared straight ahead, her jaw tight, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone white, bracing herself for words that would define the rest of her life. The victim impact statements came first, the court's acknowledgement that before sentencing could be determined, the human cost had to be fully articulated and witnessed. Lena approached the podium slowly, clutching a piece of paper that had been folded and unfolded so many times the creases had begun to tear. Her voice trembled as she began to speak, describing who Mateo was in terms that tried to capture a full human life in the inadequate space of a few minutes. She talked about his kindness, the way he used to call every Sunday just to check on the family, how he would kiss her cheek before leaving the house every single time as if it were a ritual that kept him safe. She described the night of the collision in details that made several jurors who had been dismissed after trial cry openly in the gallery. The phone call from the hospital, the moment she saw his body. The funeral where she had to be physically restrained from climbing into the grave because letting them cover him with dirt felt like abandoning him. "You left my son in the street like he was garbage," she said, her voice breaking but her eyes finding Haley's across the courtroom. "I hope every time you see a crosswalk for the rest of your life, you remember his face and what you took from this world." Raphael spoke next, his statement shorter but no less powerful, focused on the practical devastation that accompanied the emotional loss. He described the financial burden of a funeral they couldn't afford, the therapy bills for younger children who now had nightmares about cars, the way he had to go back to work 3 days after burying his son because bills didn't stop for grief. He talked about the empty space at the dinner table, the bedroom they couldn't bring themselves to clean out, the way every milestone, birthdays, holidays, the day Mateo would have graduated college, had become a fresh wound reopened. "You didn't just kill my son," he said, or his voice steady, but his hands gripping the podium hard enough to show the strain. "You killed the version of our family that got to be happy. We're different people now. We're broken people, and we'll be broken for the rest of our lives because you couldn't be bothered to stop at a red light." Mateo's younger sister spoke last, barely able to get through her statement, describing how she was afraid to cross streets, even with adults holding her hand, how she had panic attacks when she heard cars accelerating, how her brother had been her hero, and now he was just gone, erased from her future by someone who never even said she was sorry, in a way that felt real. Haley was given the opportunity to address the court, the final chance to speak before sentence was imposed. She stood slowly, her attorney beside her, and for a moment she seemed unable to find words. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, almost inaudible, and the judge had to ask her to speak up. She apologized to the Torres family, saying she thought about Mateo every day, that she wished more than anything she could undo what happened, that she would trade places with him if it were possible. The words sounded sincere, or at least more sincere than previous attempts, her voice cracking in places that suggested genuine emotion rather than performance. She said she was not a monster, just a stupid kid who made horrible choices, echoing her attorney's framing while trying to inject it with personal remorse. She acknowledged that saying sorry wasn't enough, that nothing she could say would bring him back or ease his family's pain, but that she wanted them to know she carried the weight of what she'd done. Some observers found the statement moving, evidence of growth and genuine remorse. Others, including members of the Torres family, saw it as too little, too late. Words that might have mattered if they'd come before conviction rather than after, when consequences could no longer be avoided. Judge Cole allowed the statement to settle, then began her own remarks with the kind of measured authority that commanded absolute attention. She recounted the facts of the case dispassionately: the drinking, the speeding, the distraction of recording videos while driving, the running of a red light, the impact that killed Mateo Torres, and most damningly, the decision to flee rather than render aid or call for help. She acknowledged Haley's age and the defense's arguments about brain development and capacity for rehabilitation, noting that these factors had been considered seriously and were reflected in the sentencing range she was contemplating. But then her tone shifted, becoming more pointed, more personal. "You called yourself untouchable, Miss Knox," she said, looking directly at Haley, who flinched at the word. "You believed rules were for other people. Consequences were things that happened to other families. Every time an adult in your life looked the other way, every time a ticket disappeared or a suspension was reduced, you learned that lesson again, that you were somehow exempt from the normal expectations we place on people who live in a civilized society. She continued, on her voice carrying the weight of years on the bench and a deep frustration with a system that often failed to hold privileged offenders accountable until tragedy forced it to. Youth explains poor judgment. It does not erase responsibility for the death of another human being. Brain development can help us understand why you made bad choices. It does not excuse the choice to leave a dying teenager in a crosswalk because stopping would have inconvenienced you. You had multiple opportunities that night to make a different decision. Don't drink, don't drive, don't speed, don't film videos while behind the wheel, stop at the red light, stop after the impact, call for help, tell the truth when questioned. You made the wrong choice at every single decision point. And those choices accumulated into the death of a young man who did everything right. The courtroom was so quiet that the hum of the ventilation system sounded loud. Every person present absorbed in the judge's words as she built toward the sentence that everyone had been waiting to hear. Judge Cole announced the sentence with deliberate clarity, her voice steady and final. 18 years in state prison, with eligibility for parole only after serving a minimum of 15 years, or 85% of the sentence. The number landed like a physical blow, gasps and murmurs erupting from both sides of the courtroom. It was harsher than some had expected based on her age, though lighter than the maximum possible sentence of 25 years that the prosecution had requested. The judge broke down the sentence by count, and explaining that the vehicular homicide charge carried the bulk of the time, with additional years for leaving the scene and driving under the influence, some of it to be served consecutively rather than concurrently. She explained her reasoning. The severity of the crime, the complete lack of remorse demonstrated until conviction made it unavoidable, the pattern of behavior suggesting that without serious consequences she would continue to believe rules didn't apply to her, and the need to send a message not just to Haley but to the community about the value of Mateo's life and the seriousness with which the court treated impaired driving that killed. This court must send a message, Judge Cole said, her words carefully chosen to articulate the broader purpose beyond just this one case. Not just to you, Miss Knox, but to every young driver who believes a steering wheel is a toy and other people's lives are background scenery in their personal story. Driving is not a right. It's a privilege that carries enormous responsibility. When you choose to drive impaired, to drive distracted, to treat traffic laws like suggestions, you're making a choice to gamble with other people's lives. And when that gamble results in death, there must be consequences serious enough to honor the value of the life that was taken. She ordered Haley remanded to state custody immediately to begin serving her sentence, the transition from convicted defendant to sentenced prisoner happening in the moment those words left her lips. Deputies moved forward to take Haley into custody, hands gentle but firm as they placed her in restraints. Her legs buckled slightly. On the reality of 18 years, nearly as long as she'd been alive, settling over her like a suffocating weight. She looked back toward her parents, her face crumpling as tears finally came freely, no longer controlled or calculated, but desperate and afraid. Judge Cole's final words were directed at Haley with unmistakable force, words that would be quoted in every news report and true crime analysis of the case. You are not untouchable, Miss Knox, not by the law, not by the consequences of your choices, and certainly not by the memory of the life you took. Mateo Torres mattered. His life had value equal to yours, equal to anyone's in this courtroom. And for the next 15 to 18 years, you will live with the knowledge that your choices ended his life and irrevocably changed your own. I hope you use that time to become the person you should have been before you got behind that wheel. The gavel fell one last time, the sound echoing through the courtroom with a finality that felt like a door slamming shut, separating Haley from the life she'd known, and delivering her into a future measured in years of confinement and regret. The Torres family sat quietly, not celebrating, but acknowledging that something had finally been recognized. Their son's life had mattered enough for the system to impose real consequences on the person who took it. Outside the courthouse after sentencing, the scene split along familiar lines. Reporters surrounded the Torres family, who offered a statement that Lena had prepared the night before, her hands shaking as she read it. She expressed that there was no justice that could bring Mateo back, no sentence that would make them whole, but that today the court had acknowledged his value and held someone accountable in a way that felt meaningful, even in their grief. We pray that Haley finds real remorse, not for herself, but for what she took from the world, Lena said, her voice thick with emotion. And we hope that somewhere, somehow, my son knows that we fought for him, that we made sure his life meant something, even in death. The Knox family exited through a side door, avoiding cameras, issuing only a brief statement through their attorney about plans to appeal and their continued belief that the sentence was disproportionately harsh for a teenager. The divide in community reaction was immediate. Some praised the judge for holding privilege accountable, others argued the sentence was too severe for someone so young. The debate would continue long after the cameras packed up and the courthouse emptied, the case becoming a touchstone in larger conversations about justice, youth, and whether anyone truly learned from punishment or simply endured it. The chapter closed with two parallel scenes that captured the irrevocable change the sentence represented. In a prison intake facility, Haley traded her courthouse jumpsuit for a permanent one, her personal belongings cataloged and stored, her identity reduced to an inmate number that would define her for the next 15 to 18 years. She was led through corridors that would become grimly familiar, past cells that looked identical to the one that would become hers. Her future now measured not in college semesters and career milestones, but in counts and commissary days and parole hearings years away. At the intersection of Maple and 7th, the memorial had grown into something more permanent, a small plaque installed by the city, Mateo's name and dates etched into metal that would outlast flowers and candles, a reminder to every driver who passed that a life had been lost there and that attention, sobriety, and simple human decency mattered. Every time the light turned red, cars now paused with a little more care, drivers perhaps thinking of the teenager who had followed the rules and died anyway, or the teenager who broke them and lost her freedom. The final echo brought the case to its conclusion with words that tried to capture meaning from tragedy. She smiled in court, believing herself untouchable, armored by privilege and youth and the pattern of a life where consequences had always been negotiable. In the end, it wasn't the cameras or the lawyers or even the mountain of evidence that broke that illusion. It was a judge's voice speaking for a boy who never got to speak for himself, a voice that said clearly and finally, "Your life matters, and the person who took it will carry that weight in every way our imperfect system knows how to impose." 18 years wouldn't bring him back. No sentence could. But it told the world that Mateo Torres had lived, had mattered, and that his absence would be marked not just by grief, but by accountability. And in a system that so often failed to deliver that for victims without resources or influence, perhaps that meant something after all.